There is a place beneath the skin of the most holy world in the Imperium where the air itself feels wrong. Not wrong in any way you could describe to someone who has never stood there. Not wrong in the way cold air feels wrong on a warm night, or the way silence feels wrong in a room that should be full of noise. Wrong in the way that certain places feel when something is present that should not exist at all. Something old. Something that survived the age before memory. Something that has been waiting very patiently for a very long time. The men who stand in that place wear black armor instead of gold. They carry weapons so ancient that the alloys used to forge them have no name in any current tongue. They do not speak to one another down in those corridors. They do not need to. They have done this long enough that words became unnecessary about 8,000 years ago. They pace the passages in absolute silence, and the only thing they listen for is the thing they hope to never hear any sound coming from behind the sealed doors. These are the Shadow Keepers, and what they are guarding is only one of many things the Adeptus Custodes have chosen, very deliberately, to never tell the rest of the Imperium. The Custodes are one of those subjects in Warhammer 40,000 where, the more you read, the more you realize the surface story. Golden warriors guarding the Emperor is just the part they let you see. Every layer you pull back reveals something stranger, something older, something that raises more questions than it answers. The Emperor's personal guard, the 10,000, the Auric Mortalis. They have more names than almost any other organization in Imperial history, and the reason for that is simple. They have been doing this longer than almost any other organization in Imperial history. They were there before the Space Marine Legions existed. They were there before the Primarchs were grown. They were there before the Great Crusade lit the first stars on fire with the advance of humanity across the galaxy. And in all that time, they have been collecting secrets the way some people collect debts. Quietly, relentlessly, and with the full understanding that the collection itself is dangerous. So today we are going to go somewhere that most Imperial citizens will spend their entire lives not knowing exists. We are going to walk those corridors. We are going to look at the sealed doors and try to understand what is behind them. We are going to examine what the Custodes actually know, what they are actually doing, and what they have spent 10,000 years keeping out of sight in the deepest parts of the holiest world in existence. Because the secrets of the Custodes are not just secrets about the Emperor, though there are plenty of those too, they are secrets about humanity itself, about what humanity survived, about what humanity built during its darkest hours that was so terrible it could never be allowed to walk free again, about the price of keeping a dying god alive on a machine that was never designed to be a coffin, and about the quiet, enormous question that every custodian carries, but none of them will ever speak aloud in public. What happens when the machine finally stops? Settle in. Close your eyes for a moment if you need to, because this is the kind of story that asks you to think about the dark and what might be alive inside it. If you are watching this from somewhere in the world right now, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you are, what time it is, where you are sitting, and whether you are doing this properly with the lights low. Hit subscribe if you have not already, because we go deep on lore like this regularly, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Section 1. The 10,000 and what they were made to be. To understand what the Custodes are hiding, you first have to understand what the Custodes actually are. Not the surface version, not the version where they are simply very tall, very golden warriors standing very still outside very important doors. The real version. The Adeptus Custodes predate virtually everything that the modern Imperium considers foundational. They predate the Space Marines by what is, in lore terms, a significant margin. They predate the Thunder Warriors, which is a fact that sometimes surprises people because the Thunder Warriors are often discussed as the first of the Emperor's enhanced soldiers. That is not quite right. The Custodes were being created alongside the early Thunder Warrior experiments, or perhaps even before them, in a program so different from the Astartes' creation process that calling them the same category of being is almost misleading. The differences matter because they reveal the purpose. When you create a Space Marine, the process is, by Imperial standards, almost industrial. You take an adolescent boy, you implant 19 genetically engineered organs into his body over a period of years, you subject him to hypnotic conditioning and indoctrination, and you produce a warrior. That warrior is deeply capable, superhuman, genuinely. Stronger than any normal human, faster than any normal human, possessing capabilities that place him in an entirely different biological category than the people he is meant to protect. But he was produced as part of a system. His gene seed is derived from a Primarch. His training follows doctrine developed by others. He belongs to a chapter or a legion that has its own hierarchy, its own culture, its own way of doing things that extends beyond any individual Marine. The Custodian is something else entirely. A Custodian's creation begins not in adolescence, but in what the sources describe as late infancy, before a child's identity has fully formed, before the structures of selfhood have fully calcified. The process is not implantation, but transformation, at a biological level, so deep that it touches what sources describe, quite deliberately, as the soul. Each Custodian is individually crafted. The genetic work done on each one of them is unique, tailored specifically to that particular individual, consuming an investment of time and knowledge that makes the Astartes process look, by comparison, relatively straightforward. Originally, the Emperor himself was said to have overseen the creation of each one personally. Think about what that means. The most powerful human psyker in history, a being who had spent thousands of years accumulating knowledge and power, choosing to personally invest his attention and effort in the creation of each one of his 10,000 guardians. They are not produced. They are sculpted. The result of that process is a warrior who exists in a different relationship to humanity than a Space Marine does. A Space Marine is humanity elevated. A Custodian is humanity perfected in a specific direction, fused with something that the cellular alchemy of their creation introduces into their very being, a spark, if the sources can be trusted, of the Emperor's own essence. Their loyalty to the Emperor is not programmed in the way that Astartes' loyalty is cultivated through doctrine and brotherhood and ideological commitment. It is something deeper than that, something that lives in the cells, something that functions less like a decision and more like gravity. This matters for what comes next, because it explains something that confuses a lot of people about the Custodians. They do not function as a military unit. They do not have the same brotherhood culture that Space Marines do. A Space Marine chapter draws enormous psychological and operational strength from the bonds between its members. The Custodians operate as individuals. They train as individuals. They inspect their own equipment individually, in private, not on shared parade grounds. They are bonded to the Emperor and to his purpose, but not to each other in the same way that Marines are bonded to their brothers. This is deliberate. It was designed this way. The reason is simple. The Emperor does not want warriors who are bonded to each other. He wants warriors who are bonded to him and to the things he cares about. Warriors whose loyalty cannot be redirected through the mechanics of brotherhood or hierarchy or institutional pressure. If your loyalty is to your brothers can, in extremis, convince you of things. If your loyalty is to the Emperor himself, embedded in your cells, then the only way to redirect you is to corrupt you at a level so fundamental that you are no longer really you. This is why the Custodians answered to no one except the Emperor, and after his wounding, to the Captain General and the dictates of his original will, as best they can interpret it, not to the High Lords, not to the Primarchs, not to the Inquisition, not to anyone. When an Inquisitor stands before a Custodian, the Inquisitor kneels. This is not ceremony for ceremony's sake. It is a structural reality of the Imperium. The Custodians operate outside every chain of command that exists in the galaxy except one, and that chain of command runs directly to the Golden Throne. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the first of the real secrets starts to become visible. The Custodians are guardians, not soldiers. They will tell you this themselves, and it is not false modesty. They were designed specifically to be guardians, not conquerors. The Space Marines were the instrument of expansion. The Custodians were the instrument of protection. But protection of what, exactly? The easy answer is the Emperor, and that is true, as far as it goes. But the full scope of what they are protecting is considerably larger than that. They are protecting his person, yes, but they are also protecting his secrets, his plans, his projects. The things he built and the things he contained and the things he knew that he judged were too dangerous for anyone else to know. They are protecting an inheritance of terrible knowledge that accumulated over the course of a human lifetime that stretched across thousands of years. during which the Emperor encountered things, built things, captured things, understood things that no one else alive has any context to evaluate. The Custodes, in short, are the keepers of everything. Every secret, every prison, every vault. Every sealed door and warded corridor and runic lock. They know where all the bodies are buried, so to speak. Except in this case, some of the bodies are not quite dead, and the locks are the only thing standing between the Imperium and something that cannot be undone. Understanding the full scope of that role requires going somewhere that most discussions of the Custodians never quite get to. It requires going underground, literally underground, down past the throne room, down past the foundations of the palace, down to where the corridors run through bedrock that has not seen natural light in 10,000 years, where the air moves in patterns that suggest the presence of something alive, even in the absence of any visible source of life, where the shadow keepers pace their routes in the dark and listen to the silence coming from behind the doors. But before we go there, we need to talk about the machine at the center of everything. Because you cannot understand what the Custodians are hiding without first understanding what they are hiding it for, and what the thing they are hiding it for actually is. Section 2. The Golden Throne and the Lie. Everyone believes. There is a narrative about the Golden Throne that has become so embedded in Imperial consciousness that even many readers of 40,000 lore treat it as settled fact. The Emperor sat on the Golden Throne after the Horus Heresy because his body was shattered by Horus, and the throne sustains his life and powers the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that allows warp travel throughout the Imperium. That is true, but it is also incomplete in a way that fundamentally changes how you should understand almost everything else about the Imperium. The Golden Throne was not built to be a coffin. That detail sounds simple, but follow it all the way to the end, and you arrive somewhere that completely reframes the tragedy at the heart of 40,000 lore. The Golden Throne was an immense, extraordinarily advanced piece of technology from the Dark Age of technology, already ancient when the Emperor found or built it. The exact origin is deliberately left unclear in the lore. But the Emperor's purpose for this device was not life support. It was not originally a throne in any ceremonial sense. It was a key. Specifically, it was a key into the webway. The webway. If you know 40K lore, you know the name, but it is worth dwelling on what the webway actually is, to understand why the Emperor cared about it so deeply. The webway is a network of tunnels that exists outside of normal space, created by the Old Ones, and extensively used and expanded by the Eldar, over the course of millions of years. These tunnels allow travel between points in the galaxy without entering the warp. You go in at one end, you come out at another, and between those 2 points, you are in a strange liminal space that is not real space and not the warp, but something between them, something that operates by its own rules. The warp, by contrast, is actively dangerous. It is the realm of chaos. It is where the chaos gods live. Every time an Imperial ship enters the warp, it enters a place that is literally made of emotions and psychic energy and the accumulated spiritual residue of billions of years of sentient life in the galaxy, all of it churning and shifting and populated by entities that regard human souls as both food and playthings. Every single journey through the warp carries risk. The more psychers there are in the galaxy, the stronger those entities become, and the more unstable warp travel becomes. Navigators burn out, ships are lost, cargoes arrive decades after they departed. Sometimes things come back from the warp that are not the same things that went in. The Emperor understood all of this. He understood it at a level that no one else in the Imperium approached, because the Emperor had been alive and aware long enough to watch human civilization collapse into the Age of Strife, and he had been watching the tide of psychers rising in humanity for long enough to understand where it was heading. The galaxy was moving in a direction that made the warp increasingly hostile to human travel. The Emperor wanted to change that. He wanted to build humanity a safe road. His plan was the Imperial Webway Project. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in the deep chambers that would later become the Sanctum Imperialis, the Emperor had been working for years before the Horus Heresy began on something that no one else in the Imperium knew existed. He was constructing a human extension of the Webway. He had discovered a method, the Golden Throne, as its interface, to project his psychic power into the Webway structure and create a human-built passage that linked to the Aldari network. He had tens of thousands of Mechanicum workers and adepts laboring in there. He had built an entrance. He had built corridors. The plan, if it had succeeded, was enormous in its implications. Human ships would no longer need to enter the warp. Humanity would no longer need navigators. The black ships that collect psychers from across the Imperium, feeding them to the Golden Throne to sustain the Astronomicon, would no longer be necessary because the webway does not require psychic fuel in the same way. Eventually, the Emperor intended to use Oculum test stations devices he was also building to identify the psychic gene in human populations and, over time, either remove it from the species or guide its development in a direction that would not feed the chaos gods in the warp. Humanity would grow safer. The warp would grow quieter. The chaos gods themselves might be weakened, starved of the psychic sustenance they drew from human suffering and faith and fear. This was the Emperor's actual plan, not just conquest, not just the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was the surface layer, the visible thing, the military project that bought time and resources and eliminated threats, while the real work happened underground, in secret, behind sealed doors, that the Emperor kept from even his most trusted sons. And then Magnus the Red made a mistake that broke everything. When Magnus used sorcery to send a psychic warning to the Emperor about Horus's treachery, the raw power of that sending crashed through the Emperor's carefully constructed psychic shielding around the Webway project, like a battering ram through paper. The seals that kept the warp out of the human-built tunnels were shattered. Daemons poured in. They slaughtered the thousands of workers and adepts in the tunnels. The Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, the psychic nulls whose blankness made them effective counters to warp entities, fought a desperate war inside the Webway, trying to hold the demonic tide back, and they lost. They were pushed back. The only way to keep the warp from flooding through the rupture and into Terra itself was to plant someone at the Golden Throne to hold the breach shut with sheer psychic force. That someone was the Emperor. He sat down at the Golden Throne to hold the door closed. And then Horus's armies arrived. And then the siege of Terra happened. And then the Emperor went to face Horus on the vengeful spirit and came back broken beyond the ability of his apothecaries to repair. And now he is still sitting on the Golden Throne. Not because it sustains him in any comfortable way, not because it was designed for this purpose, but because if he stops holding that door, the door opens, and Terra is flooded with everything that was pouring through those tunnels 10,000 years ago and has been building pressure behind that seal ever since. This is what the Custodes know, and what almost no one else in the Imperium understands. The Emperor is not resting on a life support machine. He is doing something actively, continuously, in agony, probably, for 10,000 years, holding a psychic pressure that would otherwise annihilate the holiest world in existence. The Astronomicon is real, and it does allow warp travel, and that is genuinely important. But the deeper truth is that the Golden Throne is a plug in a wound, and the Emperor is the plug. And if you remove the plug, the wound reopens. There is a device inside the Golden Throne that addresses the nightmare scenario of what happens if the Emperor's grip fails. The Primarch Vulcan, during the siege of Terra, was sent by the Emperor to build something. Vulcan was a master craftsman, the Primarch of the Salamanders, whose gifts ran toward making things rather than simply commanding people who made things. What the Emperor asked him to build was a dead man's switch, the Talisman of 7 Hammers. Installed into the Golden Throne, this device is designed to activate should the throne fail, and when it activates, it creates an inferno of such scope and power that it would consume not just the Imperial Palace, but all of Terra, every human on the planet, every custodian, every piece of history and knowledge and artifact that 10,000 years of accumulated Imperial civilization has stored there. All of it burned. The idea is simple and horrible. If the Emperor falls, deny the forces of chaos the planet. Do not give them the most sacred world in the Imperium. Do not give them the Webway breach to pour through. Burn it. Burn everything. Leave nothing for the dark to claim. There is another related concept in the lore, called the Terminus Decree, which the Grey Knights are apparently charged with activating under specific extreme circumstances, and which is linked in some way to the Golden Throne. The exact details of the Terminus Decree remain deliberately vague in the lore. This is one of those secrets that remains genuinely secret, even within the story, which is itself a kind of horror. But the general understanding is that it functions as a final failsafe, the kind of measure that requires activation only when all other options have truly failed, and the alternative to destroying everything is something even worse. The Custodians know all of this. Every custodian who has ever stood watch in the Sanctum Imperialis knows that under the floor beneath their feet there is a device that could incinerate their world. They guard a dead man's switch, along with a dying god, and they have been doing so for 10,000 years. But the Golden Throne and its failsafes are only the beginning, because the secrets underneath the palace do not stop with the throne. There are things deeper than the throne, things older than the heresy, things that were already locked away before the Emperor ever built the palace above them, in the time when humanity's darkest age was at its height, when science had become something that walked in the dark and took whatever it wanted. Section 3. The darkness beneath the darkness. The dark cells. Imagine a corridor, stone walls, because at some depth you are past the adamantium and ceramite and composite materials of the palace's upper levels, and you are into the bedrock of the world itself, shaped and cut by human hands from an era before memory. The lighting is minimal. Not because the technology is absent, but because full lighting in these corridors creates a visual environment that the custodians who patrol them have found, through long experience, to be worse than near darkness. In full light, you can see too much of what the walls look like. The stone has absorbed things, over 10,000 years, that you are better off not examining closely. The air here has a quality to it. Not a smell exactly, though there is that too, something old and deep and organic, in a way that should not be possible given that no organic material has been introduced to these corridors in millennia. The quality is more like pressure, like being inside something that is aware of you. The custodians who have served here for decades describe it in their internal records as a weight that never quite lifts, a sense of presence that they have learned to live alongside, in the same way that mortals learn to live alongside chronic pain. It does not go away. You simply build a tolerance for it, most of the time. These are the dark cells, also called the black cells in some sources. Formerly, in the era before the Horus Heresy, they were called the Vaults of Rhython. The name changed, the purpose did not. The Vaults of Rhython were established by the Emperor long before the palace above them took the form it currently holds. The story of how they came to exist is itself a story about the Age of Strife and about what humanity produced in its own darkness. During the long centuries when Terra was cut off from the stars, when the warlords and techno-barbarians and gene sorcerers carved the world into personal fiefdoms and fought one another with weapons that made modern military technology look restrained, human science went places it should not have gone. Not because the scientists were evil, necessarily, because they were desperate, and because desperation has a way of dissolving the categories of should and should not, until only can and cannot remain. Humanity during the age of technology had unlocked capabilities in the human genome that the careful science of the later Mechanicus cult would not recover for millennia if it has recovered them at all. They had created things, entities, biological constructs and hybrids and experiments so far outside the understood parameters of human biology that the Mechanicus, when it later encountered evidence of their existence, could not agree on whether they should be classified as human at all. They had developed technologies using principles from the dark age of technology that have no surviving documentation, that cannot be reverse engineered, that simply work through mechanisms that modern understanding cannot explain. Some of what they created could not be killed, not in any practical sense. Not with weapons available to any force in the Imperium, and this is an Imperium that has access to weapons that can crack planetary crusts and burn atmospheres away from the surface of worlds. There are things in the dark cells that were caught by the Emperor's forces and brought to Terra not because they could be neutralized, but because they could not be neutralized, and the best available option was containment. The technology used for that containment is itself remarkable and almost completely unknown outside the Shadow Keepers. Runic locks, which suggests a psychic or warp-resonant sealing mechanism. Psychic wards, which are active defenses that draw on the same principles as the wards placed on space marine equipment and the fortifications of the palace. Sanctic circles, which are a specific type of warding associated with both the Grey Knights and with older, pre-heresy traditions of psychic containment. Each of these works on a different principle. Each of them addresses a different vector of potential escape. Together they form a containment system so comprehensive and so layered that the Shadowkeepers believe they have to believe that nothing inside is getting out. The dark cells are a complex of 81 levels. That alone should stop you for a moment. 81 levels of cells and vaults and sealed chambers, running deep into Terra's bedrock, all of them holding something that has been there long enough that even the Shadowkeepers, who have been assigned here for decades, do not know everything that is in all of them. Some of the contents have not been cataloged in a very long time. Some of the cells contain not just individual entities, but entire categories of threat artifacts and relics, and biological specimens that carry with them, just by their existence, effects that the Custodians have learned to recognize and compensate for. The air of dread that you would feel walking those corridors is not imagination. It is real. It is a measurable psychic phenomenon, the combined ambient output of everything sealed behind those doors, leaking through the containment in ways that the seals cannot quite prevent. The Custodians describe it as a perpetual menace that thickens the shadows and makes them seem to move. Even enhanced transhumans, who have stood vigil in those corridors for years, report that the sense of threat never completely subsides. You learn to function with it. You do not learn to not feel it. Some of the prisoners, and that is the right word, for some of them, are not quite alive in any conventional sense, but not dead either. The sources note that not all of the inhabitants of the dark cells are truly living, but all of them have what the lore calls anima. They have something, a presence, a will, a quality that distinguishes them from mere objects. Some of the things in those cells are aware of the Custodians walking outside. Some of them have been aware, continuously, for the entire 10,000 years of their imprisonment. Try to sit with that for a moment. 10,000 years of consciousness inside a sealed cell, unable to leave, unable to interact with the world outside, except through that ambient pressure of dread that bleeds through the walls. Whatever those entities were before they were imprisoned, 10,000 years of that experience has made them into something that defies easy classification. The Shadowkeepers are the only people who know with any reliability what is in those cells, and even they do not have full accounting of everything inside them. Their records are maintained with extraordinary care, because accurate records are the difference between knowing you have a containment situation and not knowing until something has already escaped. But the sheer age of the facility and the nature of some of the contents means there are cells that have not been fully inspected in centuries. The Shadowkeepers do what they can. They are over 100 warriors, patrolling those corridors at any given time for 81 levels of this. The Lockwarden, the shield captain who commands the Shadowkeepers, is described as the sternest of all guardians. Not the most skilled in the conventional warrior sense, though the Lockwarden must be that too, but the sternest, the most unyielding, the one who will personally lead any operation to recapture anything that escapes, and who will not stop that operation until the thing is back where it belongs. The current Lockwarden at the time of the Era Indomitus is a custodian named Borsa Thursk, who has held that position for a century and a half. A century and a half as the keeper of the worst things humanity ever encountered. The sources describe him as grim and frighteningly intense, as someone whose utter fearlessness is itself a kind of specialization, because ordinary fear would be a liability in his position. And then the Great Rift opened. When the Cicatrix Maledictum tore across the galaxy, dividing it and plunging large portions of the Imperium into darkness, both literal and metaphorical, something happened in the dark cells that represents perhaps the single most disturbing moment in recent Custodes history. The Shadowkeepers conducting their rounds discovered that several cells were empty, not damaged, not breached in any visible way. The runic locks were still engaged, the wards were still active, the sanctic circles were unbroken, the cells were simply empty. Whatever had been inside those cells was gone, spirited away, as the sources put it, by some unholy force that the Shadowkeepers, with all of their knowledge and experience, and 10,000 years of maintaining those containment systems, could not explain. The Custodians who had been patrolling in the vicinity of those cells at the time were found dead, killed in ways that were consistent with the kind of entities that had been in those particular cells, which suggests that whatever happened was not instantaneous, that there was a moment of interaction before the escape. But no one can say for certain because the custodians who witnessed it did not survive. Whatever escaped from the dark cells when the Great Rift opened is now somewhere in the galaxy. The Shadowkeepers know this. Borsa Thursk knows this. The things that the Emperor himself judged too dangerous to allow to exist freely. The things that survived the age of strife and the horrors that produced them. The things that could not be killed, some of them are out there, and the Shadowkeepers have dispatched hunters into the void to find them and bring them back. This is a sentence that deserves to land properly. The Custodes, the guardians of the Emperor's person and the gatekeepers of his most sacred space, have had to go hunting in the wider galaxy for entities so dangerous that even they approach with caution. The Lockwarden himself has left Terra multiple times since the Great Rift opened, which the sources describe as deeply uncharacteristic given how rarely he had left before. The situation in the galaxy has become bad enough that the Keeper of Humanity's deepest dungeon has had to personally go looking for the things that escaped from it. What the Shadowkeepers know, what they carry with them through every dark corridor of those 81 levels, is that humanity's history is not the clean story of progress and resilience that the Imperial Creed would have you believe. There are chapters of that history that were so dark, so completely devoid of restraint or wisdom, that the only appropriate response when the Emperor found the evidence of those chapters was to lock it away and hope that no one ever found the key. The problem is that some of the things locked away did not need a key, they just needed an opportunity. Section 4. The Forbidden Vault Knowledge that cannot be unknowned. Below the Golden Throne, there is a vault. Not the dark cells, those are a separate complex, though the two are connected by corridors that have seen very little foot traffic. This vault is something different. The sources give it no formal name within the lore of the Custodians themselves. The name it has is the one that inquisitors and explorators have given it, whispered in the back rooms of inquisitorial fortresses, and written in documents that are themselves sealed at classification levels that most inquisitors never reach. The Forbidden Vault. The entrance is described as adamantium gates sealed with stasis fields. To even approach those gates, you need the seal of the High Lords of Terra, not one of them, collectively, the formal seal of the Senatorum Imperialis itself. This is a mechanism that does not exist for convenience. It exists because the people who designed this access control system understood that no individual, no matter how powerful or well-intentioned, should be able to walk through those gates alone. The knowledge inside is too significant, too destabilizing, for any individual to hold in isolation. What is in the Forbidden Vault is described as secret knowledge collected by mankind since the dawn of time. Not selected knowledge, not curated knowledge. Not knowledge filtered through the lens of what is useful or actionable. Knowledge, all of it. The records of what humanity learned and found and built and encountered through its entire civilizational history, including the parts of that history that the Imperium officially denies, minimizes, or has simply forgotten. One specific piece of that knowledge is worth naming, because of what it implies about everything else in there. Among the many secrets stored in the Forbidden Vault is a visual record of a Necron attack, not a description, not a report written by a survivor. A visual record. Footage, in some sense, that the technology of the Dark Age of technology made possible of a Necron attack happening. This is significant for several reasons. The Necrons are, in Imperial understanding, deeply ancient beings, entities of living metal, whose civilization predates humanity by an almost incomprehensible span of time, who went through a process of transferring their consciousness into metal bodies and then entering a deep sleep that lasted 60 million years. They are awakening now, in the era of the 41st millennium, and their technology is so far in advance of anything the Imperium currently possesses that encounters with them are often characterized by the Imperial forces involved not understanding what is being done to them before it is done. The idea that humanity, at some point in its distant past, had the capability to document a Necron attack and store that documentation in a place that survived the Age of Strife suggests something extraordinary. It suggests that humanity at the height of its Dark Age power was capable of encountering the Necrons and not simply being annihilated by the encounter. It suggests that the relationship between ancient humanity and the Necrons was more complicated than current Imperial understanding allows for. And it raises the question of what else is in that vault that represents knowledge of similar scope. Because if there is visual documentation of a Necron attack, what other encounters with what other beings did humanity document? What other technologies did humanity develop and then lose during the collapse? What other secrets about the nature of the galaxy and its inhabitants did those ancient scientists and explorers accumulate, and how much of it is sitting in that vault in the dark, waiting for someone with the authority and the courage to walk through those adamantium gates and start reading? The sources note that the knowledge stored in this vault can drive individuals insane. Not that it might, not that it has in the past, but that it can, as a property, as something inherent to what is stored there. Not just the volume of it, but the nature of it, information that breaks the mind that tries to contain it. Knowledge that is simply too far outside the framework of what a human consciousness is structured to process without fracturing. The Custodians guard this as well. They guard it not by standing inside it, necessarily, but by controlling access to it with a thoroughness that even the Inquisition cannot override. When an Inquisitor discovers the existence of the Forbidden Vault and makes inquiries about access, the Custodians do not explain. They do not negotiate. They redirect, or in extreme cases, they make it very clear, without explicit threat, that the inquiry is over. The Custodians' authority over who enters the Emperor's personal spaces is absolute within the Imperium. It does not matter how high your rank is. It does not matter what your mandate says. The Custodians guard the Emperor, and everything the Emperor has ever owned or known is, by extension, something they guard. What this means in practice is that there are secrets deep beneath the Imperial Palace that the rest of the Imperium is not even allowed to ask about properly. There are things locked in the Forbidden Vault that no one living has been granted access to since it was sealed. There are answers to questions that the Inquisition, the Mechanicus, the Aeldari, and every other faction in the galaxy has been trying to find for thousands of years, sitting in the dark beneath the most well-guarded building in existence. And the Custodians are the reason they stay there. Adjacent to the Forbidden Vault and the Dark Cells are other locations within the palace that reveal the scope of what the Custodians are managing. There is the Blackstone Prison, built from Blackstone, mined from Cadia, a material that carries properties that suppress psychic ability, which is used to hold dangerous rogue psychers, that the Custodians have determined are too significant to execute, but too dangerous to release. Psychers strong enough that even in a Blackstone-built prison, even with their powers suppressed, the Custodians are not comfortable having them anywhere other than under direct personal supervision. There are sealed passages within the Imperial Palace, known only to the Custodians themselves, routes through the palace's endless corridors that do not appear on any map available to anyone else, that the Custodians use to move through the building without being observed or intercepted. During the Age of Apostasy, when the High Lord Gog von der Rey had seized control of the Imperium and committed atrocities on a scale that defies easy summary, it was through these secret passages that a small group of Custodians moved to bring Alesia Dominica and the brides of the Emperor into the presence of the Emperor himself. What happened during that audience with the Emperor is not recorded. The lore simply notes that whatever the brides saw or heard in that throne room, it changed them, and they emerged from the encounter committed to ending Vandire's rule with their own hands. The Custodians do not explain what was shared. They never do. There is also the Kangba Marwu, a vast underground prison complex built into the rock beneath the Himalaysian mountains, holding the worst criminals of the Imperium, not just murderers and heretics in the conventional sense, but individuals deemed so uniquely dangerous to the structure of the Imperium itself that conventional incarceration is not sufficient. The Custodians oversee this too. Of course they do. This is the pattern that emerges when you look at what the Custodians are actually doing on Terra. Not just guarding, not just standing still in golden armor outside important doors. They are the architects and maintainers of a system of containment and control that runs through every level of the most important place in the Imperium. And they have been doing it for so long and in such complete secrecy that most of the Imperium does not know the system exists. Section 5. The Blood Games. The most disturbing training ritual you have never heard of. Here is a thing the Custodians do that is, once you understand it fully, one of the most quietly disturbing practices in all of Warhammer lore. It is called the Blood Games. Once in a while, a custodian who has demonstrated the right combination of skills, adaptability, and willingness to operate in ways that push the limits of his training and his identity is selected for a specific assignment. He is sent away from the Imperial Palace, not to fight a battle, not to escort a diplomat, not to investigate a rebellion, or eliminate a rogue psyker. He is sent away from the palace with a single objective that he must accomplish entirely alone. He must return to the palace and assassinate the Emperor. Obviously, he is not actually going to kill the Emperor, but he is going to try, with the full resources of his capability and his training, to get into the Emperor's presence with the intent to commit the act. He will use disguise, misdirection, infiltration, bribery, and violence, in whatever measure is necessary. He will exploit every weakness he can find in the palace's security. He will work through the same sequence of steps that a genuinely hostile assassin would use, because the Custodians need to understand not just what their defenses look like from the inside, but what they look like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who wants the Emperor dead and has the capability and motivation to try. This practice originated because, at some point in the history of the Legio Custodes, possibly inspired by an incident in which Alfarius of the Alpha Legion actually managed to infiltrate the palace and override a defense turret, someone probably Constantine Valdor, the first chief custodian had the insight that you cannot adequately defend against something you do not fully understand, and you cannot fully understand an attack vector without actively exploring it. So the Custodians began running their own operatives against themselves. They began studying their own security from the perspective of the enemy. The Blood Games are extraordinarily rigorous. The custodian participating must go out into the wider world, potentially traveling as far as the hives and slums of Terra, or further, and must construct a plausible identity and approach from scratch. He cannot rely on his status as a custodian. In fact, his status is the thing he must conceal, because a known custodian walking toward the palace is going to be recognized and managed, whereas an unknown individual with hostile intent is the threat profile the Blood Games are meant to investigate. In Dan Abnett's short story about the Blood Games, we follow a custodian who has been on this assignment for a year. He navigates through the slums and hives and criminal networks of Terra, building the cover he needs. At one point, when ambushed by criminals in a drug deal gone wrong, he kills them all and then uses the very drugs he was trying to acquire to temporarily stop his own hearts, allowing security scans to read him as dead and miss the concealed weapons on his person. He gets into the palace, he locates the Emperor, he raises his weapon to the point of striking, and Constantine Valdor intercepts him. He did not succeed, but he got close enough that the exercise yielded real intelligence about the security of the most important location in the Imperium. And in yielding that intelligence, it allowed the Custodians to close the gap, to adjust, to make the next attempt harder. What this tells you about the Custodians is something that goes beyond their capability as warriors. They think about failure. They actively simulate failure. In an Imperium that is culturally inclined toward a kind of rigid confidence in established hierarchy and the sufficiency of existing defenses, the Custodians are doing the opposite. They are assuming that the existing defenses are not sufficient. They are assuming that someone sufficiently motivated and capable could breach them, and they are working constantly to understand how that breach might happen so they can prevent it. This is not the behavior of an organization that is comfortable with complacency. This is the behavior of an organization that understands, at a level of deep institutional knowledge, that the thing they are protecting cannot afford a single failure. The Emperor cannot afford a single successful assassination attempt. Not one. The margin for error is zero, and the Blood Games are how the Custodians maintain that zero-error posture across 10,000 years of increasingly complex threats. Consider the implications of this practice from another angle. The Custodians train their warriors to think like assassins, to understand the mind of someone who wants the Emperor dead, to be able to inhabit that perspective fully enough to execute it convincingly, even in simulation. This means the Custodians know, better than anyone else in the Imperium, exactly how to kill the Emperor. They have thought about it more rigorously and more carefully than anyone else. They have tested and refined their understanding of his vulnerabilities more systematically than any of his enemies. They do this because they have to. Because understanding what is true about a threat is always preferable to comfortable ignorance, but it creates a situation that is, philosophically, quite extraordinary. The individuals who know best how the Emperor could be killed are the individuals charged with ensuring that he is not. The people with the most detailed operational knowledge of his vulnerabilities are the people standing between him and everyone else. In the 10th edition of the game's lore, there is a remarkable episode in the Blood Games that demonstrates how far the Custodians are willing to take this training. A Custodian who participated in a Blood Game had developed a plan that involved teleporting a cyclone torpedo, the kind of weapon used in an exterminatus, capable of destroying a planetary atmosphere, into the throne room itself. To execute this plan, she coordinated with Magos-class attendants of the Mechanicus and Cobra-class destroyers, and worked on this scheme for 2.5 years. The only reason the Blood Game was stopped when it was with the conspiracy genuinely capable of eliminating the Emperor and destroying Terra was that a communications officer whistleblower alerted the Custodians. They stopped it. They pulled the Blood Game before it went all the way. But the fact that a Custodian had developed a credible 2.5-year operational plan to effectively destroy the Emperor as a security exercise tells you something profound about the level of rigor these warriors apply to their function. They did not pull back from developing that plan because it was too extreme. They developed it exactly as far as they needed to in order to understand whether it was possible, because knowing whether it is possible is precisely the knowledge they need. The Blood Games are one of the Custodians' most closely guarded secrets. The wider Imperium does not know about them in any official sense. The idea that the Emperor's own guard routinely stages assassination attempts on the Emperor would be catastrophically destabilizing to the faith of the Imperial cult, which has elevated the Emperor to the status of a divine being, whose protection is guaranteed by his own divine will. Telling billions of people that the people guarding that divine being spend their time thinking very carefully about how he might be murdered is not information that improves the stability of Imperial civilization. So the Custodians do not tell them. The Blood Games happen in the dark, like most things the Custodians do. And the knowledge they produce stays where the Custodians put it, in the institutional memory of the 10,000, refined and updated and tested against new realities every generation. Section 6. The Eyes of the Emperor, the silent watchers no one knows about. There is a point at which a Custodian can no longer serve. Not death, they do not age in the way mortals age, and they are not often killed in the conventional sense. But the cellular alchemy that created them is not permanent in the sense of being truly unchanging. Over the course of centuries, it shifts. It degrades, not catastrophically, but in ways that the Custodians themselves measure with extraordinary precision. Reaction times slow by a fraction of a second specifically. Sources mention 1/10 of a second as the kind of degradation that signals an issue. By Custodian standards, that fraction of a second is an eternity. The kind of interval in which the difference between a perfect response and an inadequate one becomes visible. When this happens, when a Custodian determines, through his own assessment, or through the assessment of his peers, that he can no longer serve at the standard that the Custodians require of themselves, he does something that the lore describes with a kind of spare, quiet sadness. He surrenders his equipment, all of it. His guardian spear, his Custodian armor, his personal relics and awards, accumulated over centuries of service. He places them in the Hall of Armaments, where they will wait for whoever is deemed worthy to carry them next. And then he puts on a black robe, and he walks out of the palace, and he disappears. Not retires, not dies, disappears. Into the galaxy, alone, with no weapons and no armor and no official capacity. Just a person, an extraordinarily old, extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily knowledgeable person walking out into the universe that the Imperium spans. These are the eyes of the Emperor. The name tells you exactly what they are for. Even in a black robe, with no weapons, moving through the galaxy as though they are just another person, which they are not remotely. But the pretense can be maintained because the Custodians' enhancements are internal and do not produce any obvious physical markers they are watching. Watching for threats, watching for patterns of behavior that suggest something dangerous moving toward Terra, watching for conspiracies that the Inquisition has not caught and the Custodians' official networks have not flagged. They work alone, sometimes. Or they build networks of informants and agents around themselves, using a combination of their own intelligence, their centuries of experience, reading people and situations, and, when needed, fear and intimidation, to secure cooperation. The sources are clear that where loyalty and honor will not work, the eyes of the Emperor will use other approaches. They are not the Inquisition, with its massive institutional structure and its formal mandate. They are individuals operating in the shadows, with the authority of the Emperor's own guard behind them, even if they carry no credentials to prove it. When they find something worth reporting, they use secret communication channels to alert the Captain General, not official Imperial channels, not astropathic networks that might be monitored, their own channels, established by the Custodians and known only to them. The report goes directly to the top of their organization, bypassing every other layer of Imperial bureaucracy entirely. What this creates, across the scale of the Imperium, is a network of individuals who are almost impossible to detect, who have been alive for centuries and have accumulated knowledge and contacts across the breadth of human civilization, who are answering to an authority that no one else can interfere with, and who are looking specifically for things that threaten Terra and the Emperor. Not the Imperium in general, not heresy in general. The Emperor, Terra, the Golden Throne. Things that, if they ran to completion, would touch the most central fact of the Imperium's survival. How many eyes of the Emperor are there? The lore does not give a number, and that is probably intentional. They are effectively untrackable. A retired custodian in a black robe who has been walking through the galaxy for 300 years, who has accumulated a web of contacts and information across a dozen star systems, who knows secrets about the operations of criminal networks and chaos cults and alien spy operations that no other Imperial agency has access to, that person is not on any official roster anywhere. They exist outside the formal structure entirely, known only to the Custodians' own leadership and to no one else. The fact that the Custodians maintain this network at all reveals something important about how they think about their mission. The Blood Games revealed that they are not complacent about the security of the palace. The eyes of the Emperor reveal that they are not complacent about threats that might not even be aimed at the palace directly. They understand that the things most dangerous to the Emperor may not come charging through the gate in power armor. They might come slowly, building over decades, in the form of conspiracies and slow-motion plans that look like ordinary Imperial politics until the very end when they reveal their true shape. The Custodians guard against both kinds of threat, simultaneously, continuously. Consider also what the existence of the eyes tells you about what happens to the individuals involved. These are beings who have lived for centuries in one of the most intense and regulated environments in existence, the Imperial Palace, the throne room, the constant presence of the most important person in the galaxy, and then one day they walk away and enter the vast, grinding ordinariness of the wider Imperium. A custodian who has spent 500 years patrolling the corridors of the palace and standing vigil in the throne room puts on a black robe and starts walking through the slums of some mid-grade hive world, watching for signs of a chaos cult in the Hab block markets. What does that feel like? The lore does not say, because the Custodians do not discuss things like that. But it is impossible not to wonder. These are individuals who have been in the presence of the Emperor, who have stood in the Sanctum Imperialis and felt whatever it is that space carries in the presence of a being of that psychic magnitude, who have lived at the absolute center of everything that matters in their universe. And now they live in black robes in the outer reaches, watching and reporting, and never being acknowledged. They do it because that is what their mission requires, because the Emperor's safety does not end at the palace walls, because a threat that begins on the far side of the galaxy might, if it is not caught and stopped, eventually arrive at those walls, and by then it might be too late to stop it. The eyes of the Emperor are the earliest possible warning system for threats that have not yet revealed themselves as threats. They are the long, patient vigilance that complements the immediate and reactive vigilance of the Custodians in their armor. The existence of the eyes is almost certainly unknown to the vast majority of Imperial citizens. Even most Inquisitors, who make it their business to know things that are not supposed to be known, would likely not have confirmed intelligence about this network. The Custodians do not advertise it. They do not formally acknowledge it. They simply maintain it, as they maintain everything else, in the reliable dark. Section 7. What the Custodians know about the Emperor himself. This is where the secrets become almost unbearable in their implications. Because the Custodians are not just guarding the Emperor's body, and the Emperor's secrets, and the Emperor's prisons, and the Emperor's failsafe devices. They are guarding the truth about what the Emperor actually is. And that truth is considerably more complicated than the Imperial Creed allows for. The Imperial Creed, which is the dominant religion of the Imperium, and the ideological foundation of the ecclesiarchy, presents the Emperor as a god, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, or nearly so. The rightful master and father of all humanity, whose sacrifice on the Golden Throne was both a literal act of self-preservation and a divine statement about the relationship between his will and the survival of his species. The Emperor is not described in the Creed as a person who made decisions that turned out to have consequences, or as a being of extraordinary power who nonetheless had limits and made mistakes and operated under constraints that he could not fully overcome. He is described as a god, and gods are not understood within that framework as beings who have limits. The Custodians know that the Emperor has limits. They have known this for longer than the Creed has existed. Consider what they know and have known about the Webway project. The Emperor's grand plan, the project he kept secret from his own sons, from the Primarchs he had created and loved and trusted to carry out his crusade, failed. Not because it was a bad plan, not because the engineering was wrong or the ambition was misplaced. It failed because he kept it secret, and because that secrecy created conditions in which his son Magnus, trying to do something good, trying to warn his father of an existential threat, had no way to know that his method of warning would destroy something his father had spent years building. Magnus did not know about the Webway project because the Emperor had not told him. The Emperor had not told anyone. The Custodians know this sequence of events. They were there. The Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence were the ones fighting in the tunnels when the demonic tide poured in after Magnus's sending shattered the shields. They were the ones who had to pull back from the Webway and watch the Emperor's great project become unreachable in real time. They know that the reason the Emperor is on the Golden Throne is, at least in part, a consequence of a decision the Emperor made to keep his deepest work secret from the people closest to him, and that this secrecy contributed to a cascade of events that ended with his body shattered and his dream abandoned. They guard that knowledge too, the knowledge that the god is not quite what his faithful believe him to be, that he made choices that had catastrophic consequences, that the situation the Imperium now finds itself in, with the Emperor slowly dying on a machine that was never designed to keep him alive, holding a wound closed with his own will for 10,000 years, is not the expression of divine plan, but the result of something much more recognizable as human tragedy. The Custodians also know things about the Emperor's current state that are not shared with the wider Imperium. Guilliman, when he returned and met with the Emperor in the throne room after his resurrection, came out of that audience profoundly shaken. The sources describe him as believing that the Emperor is becoming something greater and more terrifying than even he had imagined possible, not dying, transforming. Not fading away, but growing into something that does not map onto any existing category of being in any clean way. Guilliman, a Primarch who had spent 10,000 years in stasis and emerged with his analytical faculties fully intact, found the encounter with the Emperor disorienting in a way he could not easily articulate. The Custodians have had 10,000 years of this. They have been in the presence of the Golden Throne, and whatever the Emperor currently is, every single day for 10,000 years. They have watched whatever process is happening to him, and they have their own understanding of what they have witnessed that has never been shared with anyone outside their order. There are also things in the lore that hint at the Emperor's continued agency, at the fact that he is not simply an unconscious power source, but a being with intentions and the capacity to act on them, at least through indirect means. The episode during the Age of Apostasy, when Alesia Dominica was brought before the Emperor and emerged ready to execute Vandir, what happened in that room? The sources do not say. The Custodians do not say. But it was not nothing. Whatever the Emperor communicated to Dominica in those moments was sufficient to redirect her from loyalty to Vandir to a commitment to end his life. An entity that is simply a biological generator of psychic power does not do that. An entity with will and awareness and the ability to communicate, even in its damaged state, does. The Cypher episode in the more recent lore is similarly suggestive. Cypher the enigmatic, legendary figure from the Dark Angels, who has been moving through the Imperium for thousands of years, carrying the pistol of the lion, finally reached the throne room and moved to approach the Emperor. A custodian stopped him, not by killing him, but with a specific statement: "Not yet." Those two words, not never, not forbidden, not yet, which implies that at some level of the planning that governs what happens around the Golden Throne, there is awareness of a timeline in which what Cypher was going to do would be permitted, just not yet. The Custodians are the only people who have continuous access to whatever is happening with the Emperor. They are the only people who have been watching him for all 10,000 years. Whatever they have observed about his transformation, his intentions, his awareness, his agency, all of that knowledge stays with them. It does not flow out to the High Lords. It does not flow out to the Primarchs. It does not flow out to the Inquisition. The Custodians hold it in the way they hold everything else carefully, quietly, and with the understanding that most of the Imperium is not equipped to process what it actually means. Section 8. The Custodians and the lie they help maintain. There is a grand institutional deception at the heart of the Imperium of Man, and the Custodians are not just aware of it, they are one of its primary mechanisms. The Imperial truth was the Emperor's official ideology during the Great Crusade. It held that the universe was rational, that science and reason were the proper tools for understanding reality, that there were no gods, that chaos was not a force of malevolent divine will, but merely the turbulence of a poorly understood dimension, that the entities of the warp were not supernatural beings deserving of worship or fear, but simply creatures of a different kind that could be dealt with through knowledge and discipline. The Emperor preached the imperial truth with considerable force, demolishing the religions and cults of worlds brought into the Imperium and replacing them with a secular framework built on the primacy of human reason. The Emperor did not believe his own ideology. He knew that the warp was real in ways that contradicted the secular framework he was promoting. He knew that the Chaos Gods were real entities of enormous power. He knew that faith, specifically faith directed toward himself, was capable of feeding his own psychic capabilities in ways that pure secular administration could not. He knew that the universe was not, in fact, simply a rational place that human science could fully account for. He kept these things secret from his sons, from his armies, from the worlds that were being incorporated into the Imperium. The Custodians knew, or at least they knew more than anyone else. They were the Emperor's closest attendants. They were present for things that the Primarchs were not present for, not because the Primarchs were excluded deliberately from everything, but because the Custodians were there always, in every quiet moment and private conference, while the Primarchs came and went. They know the full history of the decisions the Emperor made, including the ones that turned out to have catastrophic consequences when the gap between what he told people and what was true finally became impossible to manage. Now, in the 41st millennium, the Imperial Creed has replaced the Imperial truth. The secular ideology collapsed, as secular ideologies often do when they collide hard enough with the reality they were constructed to deny, and what replaced it was something the Emperor explicitly did not want: a religion, with the Emperor as its god, with the ecclesiarchy as its clergy, with all the problems that religious institutions bring in terms of political power and corruption, and the tendency of religious hierarchy to pursue its own institutional interests alongside the spiritual ones it nominally serves. The Custodians know that the Emperor did not want to be a god, or at least they know that whatever he wanted, this is not it. They watched the ecclesiarchy grow. They watched the Imperial Creed solidify. They watched as the thing the Emperor had specifically tried to prevent, the deification of himself, and the religion that would grow around that deification, became the central ideological pillar of the civilization. He created, and they did not stop it. They could not stop it, or chose not to. Perhaps because the religion, whatever its relationship to the Emperor's actual intentions, performed a function that the Imperium genuinely needed. It gave billions of people a framework for meaning and resistance in a universe that is actively hostile to humanity's survival. It gave soldiers a reason to keep fighting when the rational calculus of survival might have suggested surrender. It gave planetary governors a tool for social cohesion that secular administration alone cannot produce. So the Custodians guard the truth about the god, and they guard the lie about the god, simultaneously, in the same corridors. They know what the Emperor was. They see what the Emperor is becoming. They maintain access to the truth of all of it, and they choose, continuously, what reaches the wider Imperium and what does not. This is a kind of power that goes beyond military capability. It is the power of controlling the story, of deciding what is known and what stays hidden. The Custodians are not just warriors, or jailers, or spies. They are the curators of reality as the Imperium understands it, the keepers of the difference between what is true and what people are told is true. And they have been doing this for so long, with such complete institutional commitment to secrecy, that the two categories have diverged in ways that would probably be genuinely shattering to the Imperial citizens who have built their entire worldview on the version of reality that has been maintained for them. There is one other thing the Custodians carry that belongs in this conversation, and it relates to the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's first major soldiers, the warriors who fought and won the unification wars that brought Terra under a single banner. They were brutal and powerful, and psychologically unstable. And when they had served their purpose and the Space Marine legions were ready to replace them, the Emperor had them killed, not retired, killed. The Legio Custodes carried out the Cawl. The records of this event are sealed, known to the Custodians and to very few others. The Thunder Warriors, who knew the Emperor in his earlier phase, who fought beside him and for him during the period when he was building toward the Great Crusade, their testimony, if it had been allowed to survive, would constitute a version of the Emperor's history that is fundamentally at odds with the divine, eternal, perfect being that the Imperial Creed describes. They knew him when he was making decisions and taking actions that were, by any human moral standard, complex and sometimes troubling. The Custodians know this history because they were there for the parts of it that came after the Thunder Warriors, and because the institutional memory of their order goes back to those days. All of it stays inside, all of it. Section 9, the Great Rift, the Sleeping Giant, and what it all means. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum changed everything about the situation the Custodians find themselves in, and understanding that change is essential to understanding the current state of the secrets they are keeping. For 10,000 years, the Custodians' posture was fundamentally defensive and fundamentally stationary. The great majority of them stayed on Terra. They guarded the palace. They managed the dark cells. They ran the blood games. They sent eyes of the Emperor out into the galaxy and received their reports. They made occasional forays into the Sol system to deal with threats approaching from outside the system. They maintained the vigil with extraordinary discipline and no fanfare and complete dedication to the task. But they did not, broadly speaking, leave. The 10,000 stayed largely on Terra because that was where the Emperor was, and the Emperor was what they were for. Then Roboute Guilliman returned. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected from the brink of death 10,000 years after the heresy, emerged into a galaxy that was in the process of catastrophic deterioration, looked at what the Imperium had become, and began the process of trying to reform it. He launched the Indomitus Crusade. He reorganized the Adeptus Astartes. He established the Primaris Marines. He began moving the Imperium in directions that the 10,000 years of stagnation since the heresy had made structurally impossible until his intervention. And he met with the Captain General of the Custodians, in private, behind locked doors, in the way that all significant decisions the Custodians make are made. He and Trajan Valoris, the chief custodian, made an agreement that constitutes one of the most significant changes to the Custodians' operational mandate since the heresy. The Custodians were going to start leaving Terra in numbers they had not deployed externally since the Great Crusade, not abandoning Terra, not vacating the palace. The companions, the 300 Custodians who maintained direct, unbroken vigil in the throne room, standing in a ring around the Emperor, never sleeping, always ready, they stay. The palace guard stays. The Shadow Keepers maintain their watch in the dark cells. But the broader body of the 10,000, guided by the intelligence gathering of the eyes of the Emperor and assisted by oracular doomscriers and alpha-level astropathic intercepts, was committing to extended extrasolar operations for the first time in 10 millennia. The reason for this expansion is stated in the sources in a way that is simultaneously practical and quietly terrifying. The threat level has increased to the point where defending the Emperor by defending only Terra is insufficient. The things that could destroy the Emperor have become numerous enough and dangerous enough that they need to be engaged at distance before they can organize and move and arrive at the gates. The Custodians determined that protecting the Emperor now requires proactive operations across the galaxy, not just reactive defense of a single location. Think about what it means for the Custodians to reach that conclusion. For 10,000 years, the calculus was clear. Stay on Terra, hold the palace, maintain the vigil. The threat was understood, and the response was understood. The fact that this calculus has now shifted, that the Custodians have looked at the galaxy and determined that the old approach is no longer adequate, says something about how much darker things have gotten. And simultaneously, the dark cells are emptier than they should be. This is the combination that makes the current situation so precarious. The Custodians are spreading out, deploying more widely than they have in millennia to engage threats across the galaxy. At the same time, the cells beneath the palace, the physical containment of the worst things humanity ever encountered, have been breached in ways that no one can fully explain. And things that were in those cells are now somewhere out in the galaxy that the Custodians are also trying to patrol. The hunters and the hunted are operating in the same space, and the scale of that space is measured in hundreds of light years. Borsa Thursk, the Lockwarden, has left Terra multiple times in the years since the Great Rift opened. This is the person who, prior to this period, had left Terra only twice in a century and a half of serving in his current role. He is personally hunting what escaped from the dark cells, because the things in those cells were specifically his responsibility, and their escape is specifically his failure to address. What did escape? The lore is characteristically vague on specifics, which is probably appropriate. The general principle that entities and artifacts from the Age of Strife that could not be killed and could not be allowed to exist freely are now somewhere in the galaxy is documented. Some specific escaped entities are named in sources. A thing called the Slithering Dreamer, which was eventually killed by a Shadowkeeper named Jeharl Feldoris Gao. Note that it was killed, which means this one, whatever it was, turned out to be killable after all. Or a method was found. What the other escaped entities were, and whether they have been found, and what they are doing. These are questions the lore leaves open in the story, that is. The Custodians presumably know more, or are working to know more. Their hunters are in the field. Their eyes are watching. Their intelligence networks are active across the galaxy. Whatever the escaped entities are doing, the Custodians will find out about it through one channel or another. The question is whether they will find out in time. There is a broader horror lurking beneath the specific problem of the escaped entities, and it connects to the Golden Throne. The throne is failing. Not immediately, not catastrophically right now, but failing in the way that a machine fails when it was never designed for its current purpose and has been running without adequate maintenance for 10,000 years. The tech priests of the Mechanicus have been struggling with this problem for centuries. The failures that were first detectable around the 36th millennium have only grown more pronounced. There are mechanisms within the Golden Throne that no one alive knows how to repair, because the knowledge needed to understand those mechanisms was lost during the Age of Strife. The Custodians know this. They know it in a way that is qualitatively different from how the Mechanicus knows it, because the Custodians have been standing next to the Golden Throne for the entire duration of its decline. They have watched it get worse. They can feel, in whatever way their enhanced senses and their closeness to the Emperor's psychic presence make such perception possible, the difference between what the throne room felt like 2,000 years ago and what it feels like now. What happens if the throne fails completely? The Talisman of Seven Hammers answers that question with a specificity that should make you very cold. Terra burns. All of it. The breach in the webway reopens, and the demonic tide that has been building pressure behind the Emperor's psychic seal for 10,000 years floods through, and the talisman fires, and the most holy world in the Imperium becomes the brightest fire in the local sector of space. The Custodians have been living with this possibility for 10,000 years, not as an abstract philosophical concern, but as a concrete operational reality that they think about every day. One of the things they have been guarding all this time is a world that has a bomb inside it, and the bomb is connected to the life support machine, keeping the most important being in the Imperium alive, and the life support machine is failing. This is what the Golden Warriors in the Golden Palace are standing over. This is what the Blood Games are running to prevent. This is what the eyes of the Emperor are scanning the galaxy for evidence of. Not just threats to the Emperor's person. Threats to the stability of a situation that, if it collapses, destroys the holiest world in the Imperium, and releases something into the warp of such enormous magnitude that the long-term consequences for the galaxy's spiritual ecology are essentially unpredictable. Section 10. The weight of 10,000 years, and the questions that remain. There is a final thing to consider about the Custodes and their secrets, and it is not a secret in the conventional sense. It is not a piece of information they are hiding. It is something they carry in themselves that emerges from the accumulation of everything else. The Custodes bear a guilt that their institutional culture acknowledges but never addresses publicly. It is called, in their own internal understanding, a scar upon the soul of their order, an inescapable disgrace. Because for all that they are, for all that they were created to be and have become over 10,000 years of service, they failed at the most important moment in their history. They were unable to prevent the Emperor from falling to Horus. The Emperor did not fall because he was undefended. He chose to fight Horus himself, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, with a small company of Custodes and Space Marines and the Primarchs Sanguinius and Rogel Dorn. Horus scattered them. The Emperor fought Horus largely alone at the end, and Horus nearly killed him, wounded him so terribly that the machine that was supposed to open a door to the stars became a cage instead. The Custodes have been living with that outcome for 10,000 years. Every warrior who stands in those golden corridors knows that the vigil they are keeping is the vigil that exists because the vigil they were supposed to keep failed. Every blood game is run against the memory of a moment when the enemy came close enough to succeed. Every dark cell they patrol is a reminder of what happens when things that should not be allowed to exist go uncontrolled for too long. This is not a guilt that paralyzes them. Quite the opposite. It drives them with a kind of intensity that goes beyond institutional pride or warrior culture into something more fundamental. They cannot undo what happened. They cannot go back to the siege of Terra and stand between the Emperor and Horus at the right moment. What they can do is ensure, absolutely and without exception, that it does not happen again. That whatever the Emperor is becoming on the Golden Throne, whatever great and terrible transformation is occurring in that chamber, that even Guilliman found profoundly disquieting, it happens protected, insulated from the galaxy's attempts to interfere. Constantine Valdor, the first Captain General, the original chief of the 10,000, disappeared after the heresy, just walked out of the palace one night, and was gone. His last words on record, spoken to himself as he turned back to look at the palace one final time, were "Only in death does duty end." The implication, and it is only an implication, is that he left because he did not believe his duty was ended, that wherever he went to keep serving. The lore suggests, carefully and without committing to it, that Valdor may still be alive somewhere in the galaxy, doing something in the service of the Emperor's long-term interests. One of the oldest beings alive, carrying more direct knowledge of the Emperor's pre-heresy plans and methods than anyone else who exists. If he is out there, he is the ultimate eye of the Emperor, and what he knows about what the Emperor actually wanted, about what the Webway project was genuinely meant to accomplish, about the things the Emperor told him in private audiences 10,000 years before any of this became history. That knowledge is perhaps the single most significant repository of strategic truth about what is happening in the 41st millennium. The Custodes guard all of it. The dungeons and the vaults and the dark cells and the forbidden knowledge and the failing machine and the dying god, who is maybe not dying, but transforming, and the dead man's switch that could burn a world, and the assassins who walk. Among the faithful and the ancient things, escaped from their prisons and the guilt that never sleeps. They do it because they were made to do it, because it is written into the cells they were given when they were remade in the Emperor's image, because they are, at the most fundamental level, the last line between what the Emperor built and everything that is trying to tear it down. And they do it in silence, because everything important the Custodes have ever done, they have done without explanation. The Golden Warriors stand in the golden light, and in the dark below them, 10,000 years of secrets breathe in their sealed cells and wait. The watch continues. That is the shape of what the Custodians are actually hiding on Terra. From the failing heart of the Golden Throne to the 81 levels of the Dark Cells, from the forbidden vault that can break minds to the eyes of the Emperor drifting through the galaxy in black robes, from the blood games that simulate assassination to the ancient guilt that drives an order of post-human warriors to levels of dedication that even the Space Marines cannot fully comprehend. It is not one secret. It is a constellation of secrets arranged around a dying god and a broken machine, and the question that no one in the Imperium is allowed to ask out loud, but that every Custodian carries in their chest every single day. What comes next? If you made it to the end of this, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I read every one. If there are specific corners of this lore you want to go deeper on the Dark Cells, the Webway Project, Valdor's disappearance, the Talisman of Seven Hammers, what happens when the throne finally fails, let me know below. Because each of those threads deserves its own full dive. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already, because lore like this is what this channel exists for, and there is a great deal more where this came from. The Custodians are watching. We might as well watch back. Section 11. The Companions and the Silent Company. 300 years of standing. Still. There is a specific group of Custodians within the 10,000 that rarely gets discussed in the depth it deserves, and understanding them tells you something important about the nature of the watch the Custodians keep. They are called the Companions. 300 warriors. The number does not change. When one falls or is removed from this role, another takes the position. 300, always 300, standing in a ring around the Emperor on the Golden Throne, not taking shifts, not rotating on a schedule of hours or days, standing continuously, in what the lore calls the Silent Company, because they do not speak when they are in that ring. They stand in complete silence, armored, armed, every sensory capability they possess oriented outward for signs of threat for the entire duration of their assignment to the Companions. The longest recorded stint in that ring belongs to a Custodian named Asteron Kalos, 100 years. 100 years of standing in that circle, never sleeping in the conventional sense, never speaking, never fully leaving that posture of total readiness. 100 years of the ambient psychic pressure of the Golden Throne, the sound of the life support mechanisms that keep the Emperor's body functioning, the distant vibrations of a palace that holds millions of people in its outer precincts, and the knowledge that the most important being in the galaxy is behind you. Think about what that does to a person. Even a person who is not really a person in the conventional sense, who has been remade at a cellular level to be something beyond ordinary human limitation. Think about what 100 years of that would produce in a consciousness that is, at its core, still recognizable as having been built on a human foundation. What does the world look like after a century in that room? What do your thoughts sound like? What does time mean to you? Kalos surrendered his place. After 100 years, he did not collapse. He did not request relief. At some point, the watch was over for him, and he stepped out of the ring, and presumably did what all the Companions do when they step out of the ring, resumed other duties, trained, maintained his capability, and waited for the next assignment. Whether he became one of the eyes of the Emperor eventually, walking out in a black robe, is not recorded. The Companions represent something philosophically important about the Custodians' understanding of their role. They do not believe that the defense of the Emperor can be maintained purely through active, dynamic response. They believe it also requires presence, constant, unyielding, alert presence in the most critical location. The ring around the throne is the innermost layer of a layered defense that extends outward through the palace, through the city, through the Sol system, and ultimately through the galaxy. But it is the innermost layer that the Custodians consider most essential. No enemy has ever breached the Sanctum Imperialis and reached the throne room while the Companions were on watch. This is not simply a matter of luck or the absence of serious attempts. The forces arrayed against the Emperor across 10,000 years of history include armies that destroyed entire worlds, Primarchs who commanded the loyalty of entire Space Marine legions, daemons of such power that they could reshape local reality through their presence. None of them got to the ring. None of them got to the throne. Whether that holds going forward is one of the unanswerable questions of the current era. The Great Rift has changed the security calculation in fundamental ways. The number of potent threats operating in the galaxy simultaneously has increased beyond historical precedent, and the Custodes, in response to this, have spread their forces more widely than at any point since the Great Crusade. The palace is not less guarded in absolute terms, but the mathematics of protection have gotten more complicated. What the companions know, in the way that only people who have spent decades in the presence of something can know it, is the Emperor. Not the Emperor as doctrine or myth or theology, the actual Emperor, whatever he currently is, in whatever state of between life and death he currently occupies. They are the beings in the galaxy who know him best, and they will never tell anyone what they know, because that knowledge is the most sacred thing they carry, and the Custodians do not share sacred things. The experience of the companions also raises a question that is never directly addressed in the lore, but that becomes unavoidable when you spend time thinking about their assignment. These are beings with senses and perceptions that go significantly beyond ordinary human parameters. They are standing next to the most powerful psychic presence in the history of the human species, a presence that has been building and changing and accumulating force for 10,000 years of concentrated existence on the Golden Throne. What do they perceive? What bleeds through from the Emperor's psychic presence into their enhanced awareness, day after day, decade after decade? The sources describe something about the Sanctum Imperialis that sounds like it should be comforting, but is instead quietly terrifying once you think about it. The presence within that space is described as overwhelming in a way that ordinary human consciousness cannot prepare for. When the Inquisitor Jacques Draco found his way into the throne room in the novel Inquisitor, the experience was described as an encounter with something so vast and so alien to normal human experience that it defied his ability to process or communicate it. Guilliman, coming out of his audience with the Emperor in the era Indomitus, was visibly shaken. A Primarch, a being whose capabilities dwarf those of any Custodian, shaken by an encounter with what lives on the Golden Throne. The companions stand in that space for centuries. They are marinated in it. The psychic environment of the Sanctum Imperialis soaks into them through every sensory channel available to their enhanced bodies over the course of their vigil. Whatever they become as a result of that prolonged exposure, they become it quietly, in the gold-lit dark of the holiest room in existence, without ever saying a word about it to anyone. This is not the only way the Custodians are changed by their proximity to the Emperor. The cellular alchemy that created them includes what the sources describe as a spark of the Emperor's own divinity, not metaphorically, but in some literal sense that the bioalchemy achieves. A quality introduced into their cells during creation that connects them to the Emperor in a way that other beings are not connected. This connection does not simply provide them with loyalty in the abstract. It seems to function as a kind of ongoing attunement, a resonance between what they are and what the Emperor is, that may deepen over time in the presence of the Golden Throne. This resonance is probably also why the Custodians know things they should not be able to know through conventional channels. There are accounts in the sources of Custodians taking actions that appear to be guided by knowledge they could not have acquired through intelligence gathering or normal information flow. Actions that turn out to align precisely with what the Emperor would have wanted, in situations where the Emperor has no conventional means of communicating his will. It may be that the cellular connection allows for something that is not quite communication in any recognizable sense, but that nonetheless transmits something of the Emperor's intent to those most deeply attuned to his presence. If this is true, it raises profound questions about the relationship between the Custodians' institutional decision-making and the Emperor's actual will. When the Captain General makes a decision in the era Indomitus to expand the Custodians' operations beyond Terra, is that a rational strategic judgment made in the light of available intelligence? A response to guidance received through this deeper attunement? Some combination? The sources do not resolve this question, and the Custodians would not answer it if asked. Section 12. The Architecture of Secrets, How the Palace Keeps Its Mysteries. The Imperial Palace is not simply a very large building. At the scale it has reached in the 41st millennium, after 10,000 years of construction and fortification and expansion, it is functionally a continent. Its outer walls encompass a region that spans the old Himalayan mountain range, the Himalayas now, as the Imperium calls them, and the structures built on and through and within those mountains rise higher than any natural peak and dig deeper than any natural valley. It is the most complex constructed space in the known galaxy, and no single record exists that catalogs all of it. The Custodes know all of it. This is not a metaphor. The sources state explicitly that the levels and byways of the palace can take a lifetime to learn, and that only the Adeptus Custodes know them all. This knowledge is itself a form of power that is easily overlooked when you think about the Custodes, primarily as warriors. They have spent 10,000 years learning every corridor, every hidden passage, every concealed entrance, every route through the palace that does not appear on the official maps, because it was built specifically to not appear on the official maps. During the Age of Apostasy, the relevance of this knowledge became dramatically visible. Goge Vandir had seized control of the Imperium through political manipulation, mass murder, and the corruption of the brides of the Emperor, who became his personal bodyguard and his instrument of terror. The Custodes, who answered to the Emperor rather than to any High Lord, needed to move through a palace that was now controlled by a hostile power. They used passages that Vandir's people did not know existed. They navigated through a building that their enemy nominally controlled, without their enemy having any awareness of their movements. They brought Alesia Dominica to the Emperor through those passages, and whatever the Emperor communicated to her in that audience changed the course of Imperial history. Vandir died. His age of apostasy ended, and the Custodes returned to their vigil, and they never explained, not to anyone, what had happened in that throne room. The hidden passages are maintained, kept clear, periodically checked for integrity by custodians who know which ones they are. No map of them exists outside the institutional memory of the Custodes themselves. They are not passed on in written form or recorded in any document that could be stolen or copied or accessed by someone unauthorized. They are learned through direct instruction from existing custodians, passed through the hierarchy of the order, in the way that the most sensitive knowledge has always been passed person to person, in close confidence, with the understanding that it stays where it is placed. The depth of the palace, in the literal sense, downward, into the bedrock, is where most of its significant secrets are kept. The upper levels, the spires and cathedral domes and processional halls and administrative districts that the wider Imperium knows about through artistic renditions, and the accounts of the very few people who have ever been permitted inside, those are the public face of a structure whose true nature exists hundreds of levels below the surface. The sublevels dig into Terra's bedrock to depths measured in hundreds of kilometers in some places. The sheer physical scale of what exists below the visible palace is difficult to conceptualize without sitting with the numbers for a while. In those depths, you find the dark cells, the forbidden vault, the machinery of the Golden Throne and its associated systems, the ruins of the Imperial Webway Project's entrance, and the corridors that once led into the Webway itself. You find the Blackstone Prison and its Psyker inmates. You find storage facilities for artifacts that the Mechanicus does not know exist and has never been granted access to examine, relics of the dark age of technology that the Custodes deem too significant or too dangerous for the Mechanicus to have. Beyond these known elements, the palace sublevels contain older things still, structures from construction periods that predate the current era of the Imperium, some predating the heresy, some going back to the Unification Wars and further. Not all of those older strata have been fully explored by anyone in recent centuries. The palace is old enough and vast enough that the honest answer to what is at its most remote and deepest levels may simply be that no one has checked in a very long time, and the checking would take longer than the available personnel can spare. This is not a comfortable acknowledgement. The Custodes do not like gaps in their knowledge of the space they are responsible for, but the palace has outgrown the capacity of any organization to perfectly account for, even an organization as dedicated and capable as the 10,000. They know what they know. They maintain what they maintain. For the rest, they do what you do when you are responsible for something too large to fully account for you. Focus on the parts that seem most significant. You maintain the most critical systems, and you trust that the things you do not know about are quiescent rather than active. The enormous dome-like structures in the inner palace, some large enough to contain their own weather systems, where microclimate clouds drift under painted vaults and rain inside the dome is considered. By palace inhabitants a portent of good fortune, are simultaneously the grandest architecture in the known galaxy and the most irrelevant to what the Custodians are actually doing. Those vast spaces are ceremony. They are the architecture of power and faith and accumulated history. The Custodians patrol them, yes, because the palace's security requires it, but what happens there is the visible, presentable surface of an institution whose most significant work happens somewhere else entirely. The Custodians are equally comfortable in the grand ceremonial halls and the lightless corridors below the bedrock. They do not distinguish between the sacred spaces in the way that ordinary Imperial citizens do for the Custodians. Every inch of the palace is equally sacred because every inch of the palace is equally their responsibility. The grand processional route used for important ceremonies and the unmarked service corridor that runs 300 levels below it are both within their remit, both within their knowledge, both within their protection. This comprehensiveness is part of what makes the Custodians such a different kind of institution from anything else in the Imperium. They do not have a remit that begins here and ends there, a jurisdiction that can be invoked and limited. Their responsibility extends from the outermost wall of the Imperial Palace to the deepest cell in the dark cells, from the surface of Luna, where Custodians maintain regular patrols, to the distant reaches, where the eyes of the Emperor walk in their black robes. The palace is a single, seamless, total responsibility that they have never handed off to anyone else and never will. Section 13. The Mechanicus, the Custodians, and the War over Knowledge. The relationship between the Adeptus Custodians and the Adeptus Mechanicus is one of the most interesting and least discussed dynamics in Imperial politics. It is characterized by mutual dependence, deep mutual distrust, and a fundamental disagreement about who should have access to the most important technologies in the Imperium. The Mechanicus needs the Custodians. Without the Custodians' permission, no one enters the Sanctum Imperialis. The tech priests who tend the Golden Throne, who perform the rituals of maintenance that are the closest thing available to actual understanding of its function, do so entirely at the Custodians' sufferance. The Custodians can revoke that access. They have the authority to do so and the physical capability to enforce it. The Mechanicus cannot maintain the Golden Throne without the Custodians' ongoing permission. At the same time, the Custodians need the Mechanicus. The Golden Throne is failing, the mechanisms deteriorating, the maintenance tasks growing more complex and more urgent with each passing century. The Custodians are warriors and guardians. They are not tech priests. They understand the Golden Throne in the way that guards understand the thing they guard. They know its rhythms, its signs of health and decline, its sounds and emanations, but they do not know its interior engineering. For that, they need people who do. This creates a dynamic of genuine interdependence between two organizations that are also fundamentally in competition over something neither of them says out loud, but both of them clearly understand. The Mechanicus wants access to the technologies the Custodians are sitting on. The weapons made from Adrathic principles and Lastrum alloys, the armor and tools that the Custodians have maintained for 10,000 years using methods that are not Mechanicus methods, the relics in the deep vaults of the palace that the Custodians have sealed from Mechanicus access. All of this represents archaeological and technical treasure of immense significance to an organization whose entire identity is built around the acquisition and preservation of technology. The Custodians will not give it to them, not unconditionally, not at the Mechanicus's request. They share what they choose to share, on terms they set, and they do not explain their reasoning. The Mechanicus has spent 10,000 years trying to negotiate greater access to the palace's technological holdings, and has achieved nothing resembling a satisfactory outcome. Every approach diplomatic, through the High Lords, through Mechanicus liaisons to the Custodians' leadership, through individual tech priests who have cultivated relationships with individual Custodians, has produced at most incremental, carefully managed concessions. There is a particularly remarkable episode from the Era Indomitus period. The Space Fortress Phalanx, the mobile base of the Imperial Fist's Space Marine chapter, suffered catastrophic damage during the events around the formation of the Great Rift. The damage was beyond the chapter's own capability to repair, and beyond what the available Mechanicus resources in the Sol system could address through conventional means. The Shadowkeepers opened one of the dark cells and gave the Imperial fists the technology needed to restore the Phalanx. Read that again. The Guardians of the Deepest, the most dangerous prison beneath the Imperial Palace. The warriors who spend every moment of their existence ensuring that nothing inside those cells ever gets out, opened a cell and provided something from inside it to an outside party in service of a military necessity. This tells you several things. First, that at least some of the contents of the dark cells are not entities but artifacts, things that can be removed and used without necessarily unleashing whatever danger they represent in uncontrolled conditions. Second, that the Custodians make situational judgments about when the contents of those cells can serve a purpose that outweighs the risk of their use. Third, and perhaps most importantly, that the Custodians have resources available to them that are so significant they can repair damage that neither the Mechanicus nor the Astartes can address through any other means. What else is in those cells that could serve such purposes? What other technological relics from the Age of Strife, too dangerous to allow into general circulation but useful under controlled conditions, are sitting in those 81 levels? The lore does not say. The Custodians do not say. But the Phalanx incident establishes that the answer is not nothing. The dark cells are not only a prison, they are also a vault. The Custodians are simultaneously jailers and curators of the worst and most powerful things humanity ever created. There was also the extraordinary situation documented in sources about the period leading up to the formation of the Great Rift, in which a Lord Inquisitor attempted to smuggle a dark Eldar homunculus onto Terra in cooperation with 3 members of the High Lords of Terra, the Fabricator General, the Speaker for the Chartist Captains, and the Master of the Astronomicon, as part of a secret project to try to address the Golden Throne's failing mechanisms. The scheme, whatever its ultimate intent, involved introducing a Xenos being of significant expertise in biological modification to the most sacred world in the Imperium without the Custodians' knowledge or consent. The scheme failed, partly because the homunculus had its own agenda, and partly because the Custodians, through their intelligence networks and the investigations of a custodian named Navradaran, became aware of it. The homunculus was eventually found and killed. The High Lords involved faced consequences. The Custodians did not publicly explain their discovery of the conspiracy, the methods they used to track it down, or the full scope of what the conspirators were attempting. They simply acted, as they always do, and left the wider Imperium to draw whatever conclusions it could from the visible outcome. This episode reveals several layers of Custodians' operations simultaneously. It reveals that even the High Lords of Terra are not beyond the Custodians' surveillance or their ability to act against. It reveals that the Custodians have intelligence capabilities operating within the highest levels of Imperial governance that the people being monitored do not know about. And it reveals that the question of what to do about the failing Golden Throne is one that drives even the most senior figures in the Imperium to schemes that they know the Custodians would not sanction, which tells you something about the level of desperation surrounding that problem. The Custodians are also known to maintain technologies and weapon systems that are explicitly outside the Mechanicus' standard canon, and that the Mechanicus has never been permitted to study. The Adrathic weapons devices that use a principle of destruction fundamentally different from conventional energy weapons, operating through a mechanism that dismantles matter at a level that leaves barely anything behind, are weapons that wars have been fought over in the past. Other factions have tried to acquire them. The Custodians do not share them. The Lastrum bolt rounds that the Custodians use, made individually by hand through processes that take far longer than standard bolter ammunition production, represent a level of craft and material science that is not available elsewhere in the Imperium. The Custodians' vehicles, their Coronis grav carriers, and their Caladius grav tanks, are not manufactured by the Mechanicus. They come from sources and methods that the Custodians maintain independently. All of this is a form of technological sovereignty that the Mechanicus finds profoundly uncomfortable because it represents the existence of a capability base that they do not control and cannot access. For an organization whose entire institutional identity is built on the belief that all technology in the Imperium flows through and from the machine cult, The existence of an independent technological tradition maintained by the Custodians is a standing rebuke to that identity. The Mechanicus deals with this reality by declining to think about it too directly, and the Custodians deal with the Mechanicus's desire to think about it by ensuring that no Mechanicus representative ever gets close enough to the relevant technology to satisfy that curiosity. Section 14. The Psychic Dimension. What living next to a dying god does to the mind. There is a dimension to the Custodians' situation that does not get nearly enough attention, and that is the psychic and spiritual dimension of what it means to live in proximity to the Golden Throne and the Emperor for extended periods of time. The Emperor is, by any measure, the most powerful human psyker in history. Whatever he is becoming on the throne, whatever the 10,000 years of his current existence have done to his psychic presence, that presence is a constant, pervasive feature of the Sanctum Imperialis and the areas around it. You cannot stand near the Golden Throne and be unaffected by what radiates from it. This is not speculation. The sources document it. Guilliman, a Primarch with capabilities that place him far above ordinary human levels, found the encounter with the Emperor on the Golden Throne disorienting in ways he could not easily characterize. Mortal humans who have found their way into the throne room describe the experience in terms that suggest an encounter that operates beyond the ordinary parameters of consciousness. The Custodians stand in that space continuously. The companions stand in that room for decades without leave. What does the accumulated exposure to that psychic environment do to beings who are already enhanced to have greater psychic sensitivity than ordinary humans? The lore is quiet on this, in the way that the lore is quiet about many things regarding the Custodians' inner experience. But there are hints. The Custodians who serve longest in the Sanctum Imperialis are described as changed by the experience, in ways that other Custodians can perceive but not easily describe. They carry something with them, a quality of presence, a weight to their silence that goes beyond simple age and experience. It is the kind of thing you might describe, if you were being imprecise, as haunted. Except that word implies something negative, and the Custodians who have spent the most time in proximity to the Emperor are not diminished by the experience. They are, if anything, more certain, more settled in their purpose, more clear-eyed about what the watch requires, which suggests that whatever the prolonged exposure to the Emperor's psychic presence does to them, it does not undermine them. It reinforces them in ways that are difficult to square with ordinary frameworks of how psychic environments affect human minds. Perhaps because the cellular connection between the Custodians and the Emperor means that his presence does not impinge on them as an external force. It resonates with what is already there, deepening rather than disturbing. The atmosphere of the palace itself, at its deeper levels, carries psychic contamination from multiple sources. The dark cells, with their collection of things that have anima and awareness, even if they have nothing else, contribute a background dread that bleeds through the containment. The webway breach beneath the throne, held closed for 10,000 years, creates a kind of pressure in the psychic environment of the lowest levels that experienced psychers who have been permitted to enter those spaces describe as a constant awareness of an enormous weight pressing from the wrong direction, as though reality is thinner there and something is pushing against the thin part from the other side. The Sisters of Silence, whose nature as blanks makes them effective counters to psychic phenomena in their vicinity, were once the natural complement to the Custodians for exactly this reason. Where the Custodians guard physically and martially, the Sisters of Silence guard through what they are. Their presence suppresses psychic activity. Around them, psychers cannot function. Warp entities cannot manifest. The ambient psychic pressure that characterizes the palace's deep levels is diminished in their vicinity. The Custodians and the Sisters of Silence are called together the Talons of the Emperor, right hand and left hand. The partnership dates back to the Great Crusade and earlier. During the war in the Webway, when the demonic tide poured through and the Custodians fought to hold the breach, the Sisters of Silence fought alongside them. Their blankness made them uniquely effective against the demonic entities they faced, in ways that the Custodians' physical superiority alone could not replicate. That partnership still exists, and it is particularly relevant to the management of the palace's psychic environment. The Sisters' presence in the deep levels is part of the containment system in ways that are not always explicitly discussed in the sources, but that become clear when you think about what the Dark Cells are up against. 100 black-armored custodians patrolling those corridors are extraordinary guardians in the martial sense. 100 custodians, accompanied by Sisters of Silence, are extraordinary guardians in a deeper sense, because the Sisters' blankness acts as a suppressor on whatever ambient psychic output the sealed entities in the cells are managing to produce. The combined effect of the Custodes' martial vigilance and the Sisters' psychic suppression represents the best available answer to the question of how you keep things contained that were not designed to be containable. It is not a perfect answer. The empty cells after the Great Rift's opening demonstrate that. But it is the best answer that exists, and the Custodes have been making it work for 10,000 years. What it costs the individual beings doing it, the Custodians who pace those corridors for decades, the Sisters who maintain their suppressive presence in the dark levels, the Lock Warden who has spent a century and a half as the guardian of the worst things ever sealed away, is something that the sources do not fully engage with. The Custodes are not an organization that talks about what things cost. They talk about what things require. What is required, they do. That is the end of the conversation. Section 15. The question they cannot answer. What happens when the Emperor dies? There is a question that every custodian carries, and that none of them will discuss in any context accessible to outside observers. It is not a question they can avoid, because the trajectory of the situation they are managing makes it impossible to avoid. The Golden Throne is failing. The Emperor's body has been in an extreme state of biological stress for 10,000 years. The mechanisms that sustain him are deteriorating beyond anyone's current capacity to repair. Every year that passes, the situation becomes more precarious. What happens when the Emperor finally dies? The official answer, the answer embedded in the containment design of the Golden Throne itself, is the Talisman of 7 Hammers. Terra burns. The webway breach opens and the demonic tide floods through, and the failsafe fires, and the holiest world in the Imperium is reduced to ash. The Astronomicon goes dark. Warp travel throughout the Imperium becomes nearly impossible. The sectors and systems and worlds that depended on that beacon for navigation fragment from the greater whole, in ways that cannot be recovered from within any realistic time frame. The Imperium does not survive the Emperor's death in any form that resembles what it currently is. That is the hard answer, the answer implied by the technical realities of the Golden Throne and its function. But there are other theories, older ideas, held by individuals who have thought about this longer and from different angles. The most significant of them is sometimes called the Star Child theory, the idea that the Emperor's dying on the Golden Throne is not an ending, but a transformation, that the psychic energy accumulated over centuries of the Emperor's slow death will eventually coalesce in the warp into something new, a reborn entity. A being of pure psychic force that has left the broken biological vessel behind and exists in the immaterium in a way that might allow it to oppose the Chaos Gods in their own realm, directly rather than through the proxy of the Astronomicon and the ward against demonic incursion. Some hints in the lore suggest that Guilliman's encounter with the Emperor on the Golden Throne left him believing something along these lines. That whatever the Emperor is becoming, it is not simply deterioration. That the Companions and the Custodians have been watching not a slow death, but the slowest possible transition into a different kind of existence. That the Emperor himself, in the moments at the end of the Siege of Terra when he told Malcador he had foreseen all of this, may have been speaking of the current situation as a stage in a longer plan rather than a failure state. If that is true, and the lore leaves it deliberately ambiguous, then the Custodes' vigil has a different character than it appears. Not the vigil of people protecting a dying patient who they know will eventually die, holding on to something that will be lost. But the vigil of people maintaining the conditions for a transformation, ensuring that the process completes undisturbed, keeping the galaxy's interference at bay, while something that cannot be named with any existing word finishes becoming itself. The Custodes guard this uncertainty too. They do not affirm the Star Child theory. They do not deny it. They do not engage with any framing that attempts to reduce the situation to something predictable and containable within existing categories. They maintain the watch. They continue doing what they have done for 10,000 years. And if they have their own understanding of what is happening in the throne room, what the companions have witnessed over a century of standing in that ring, what the ambient psychic environment of the Sanctum Imperialis suggests about the direction of the Emperor's current existence, all of that stays where it has always stayed, inside. The Cypher episode in the more recent lore is one of the most suggestive pieces of evidence on this question. Cypher, the enigmatic figure from the Dark Angels, who has been moving through the Imperium for thousands of years, whose agenda no one can fully trace, who carries the Lion's pistol, and has been present at significant moments of Imperial history, in ways that resist simple explanation, finally reached the throne room and moved to approach the Emperor. A custodian stopped him, not by killing him, but by speaking 2 words. Not yet, not never, not forbidden, not impossible, not yet, which is an extraordinary choice of words. It implies a timeline. It implies an awareness within whoever gave that custodian their guidance, that there is a correct moment for whatever Cypher was going to do, and that moment has not yet arrived. It implies a plan, not the reactive improvisation of an organization managing a crisis as best it can, but a plan with stages, with timing, with a logic that extends into a future that the planners can see even if no one else can. The Custodians are the guardians of that plan, whatever it is. They are its executors. They are the force that ensures it runs to completion undisturbed. And they cannot explain it, either because they do not know the full shape of it themselves, or because knowing would compromise it, or because the kind of knowing that would be required to explain it genuinely exceeds what language can convey about something that operates at the scale of the Emperor's intentions. There is one other layer to the question of the Emperor's death that almost never gets addressed in discussions of this topic, and that is what happens to the Custodians themselves. Their cellular loyalty to the Emperor is not an institutional loyalty, not a doctrine, not a choice they make, in the same way that a Space Marine chooses to follow his chapter's code. It is biological. It is built into what they are. If the Emperor dies, truly dies, in whatever way is even possible for a being of his nature, what does that do to the internal experience of 10,000 beings whose very cells are tuned to his presence? The sources cannot answer this. And even if they could, the Custodians would not be the ones publishing their response. But it is part of what they carry when they carry the question of what comes next. Not just the institutional and strategic question of what happens to the Imperium, the deeply personal and deeply strange question of what happens to them, to their experience of themselves, when the anchor of their existence is no longer present to be anchored to. The Custodians are human in origin, remade and elevated beyond ordinary human parameters, but built on a foundation that is recognizably human. They feel things. They think things. They have been changed in ways that make their experience of those things different from ordinary human experience, but different is not absent. The combination of cellular loyalty and proximity and accumulated experience and the weight of 10,000 years of watching something that means everything to them slowly and irreversibly deteriorate must produce an interior life of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary pain, none of which they show, none of which they discuss. The golden armor is the visible face of an order that has made privacy into an absolute discipline, that has made the suppression of personal expression into a professional requirement, so complete that even after 10,000 years of doing this, it is impossible from outside to know whether the requirement has made the expression disappear or simply made it invisible. Closing, the watch that never ends. That is the shape of what the Custodians are actually hiding on Terra. From the failing heart of the Golden Throne, which was never meant to be a coffin but has become one, to the 81 levels of the dark cells, where the worst things humanity ever created sit in their sealed chambers and wait for something the Shadowkeepers spend every waking moment trying to prevent. From the forbidden vault beneath the throne, where knowledge that can break minds has been accumulating since before the Horus Heresy, to the eyes of the Emperor drifting through the galaxy in black robes, watching for threats no one else has yet identified. From the blood games, where custodians practice being assassins so they can prevent assassination, to the ancient cellular guilt that drives an order of post-human warriors to levels of dedication that even the Space Marines cannot fully comprehend. It is not one secret. It is a constellation of secrets arranged around a dying god, and a broken machine, and a galaxy that grows more hostile with every passing century, and the question that no one in the Imperium is allowed to ask out loud, but that every custodian carries in their chest every single day. What comes next? The Custodians are the last people who know and the last people who will say. They guard everything and explain nothing, and keep the watch with a discipline that has endured 10,000 years of the galaxy doing its worst, and they will keep doing it for whatever time remains. The Emperor sits in the dark at the bottom of everything, and the Custodians stand between him and the universe. Some things are worth standing for, until there is nothing left. The watch continues. If this reached you in some corner of the world, you want to share, whether it is the middle of the night or the early morning or something in between, tell me in the comments where you are, what time it is, what you are listening with, and whether the lights are low. I read them all, and I find them genuinely moving, knowing this reaches that far. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a great deal more where this came from. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 is inexhaustible in the best possible way, and we have barely started going deep. Until next time, rest well, wherever you are. Extended deep dive section on Constantine Valdor and the First Secrets. Constantine Valdor is one of the most important figures in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and also one of the least understood, which is appropriate, because Valdor himself operated at the intersection of importance and deliberate obscurity in a way that defined the entire character of the institution he built. He was the first of the 10,000, or at least the first successfully created one. In the framing that the sources offer, he himself was not entirely certain whether he was the first custodian created or simply the first who survived the process and served long enough to matter. His origins are extraordinary, even by the standards of extraordinary origins that characterize all the figures in the Emperor's inner circle. The sources indicate that the Emperor moved entire armies across continents to locate and retrieve the child who would become Valdor. The parents of that child were killed by the Emperor in that process. Valdor himself remembers almost nothing of this early period, which may be deliberate. The process of creating a custodian, beginning in late infancy, may be one that overwrites the prior self so completely that the pre-custodian life is simply not accessible as memory anymore. What emerged from that process was the individual who would go on to acquire 1,932 names by the time of the assault on Terra. Names, in the custodian tradition, represent documented deeds. Each name added to a custodian's title is an acknowledgement of something significant done in service to the Emperor. 1,932 names for a single individual, across the duration of the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, and the earliest stages of the Horus Heresy, is a record that speaks to a volume and intensity of significant action that is difficult to process. For reference, the custodians carved those names on the inside of their armor. Valdor's armor must have been, by the end, quite densely inscribed. Valdor was more than just the first and best warrior of the 10,000. He was, alongside the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite, one of the three individuals who constituted the ruling triumvirate of Terra after the Unification Wars, not a junior partner to that authority, not a functionary who executed the decisions of others. A partner in the truest sense, present for decisions, consulted on decisions, making his own judgments about what the Emperor's interests required that were trusted at the highest level. This means Valdor knew things. He was present for conversations between the Emperor and Malcador that no one else witnessed. He was in the room when decisions were made that shaped the entire future of the Imperium, including the decisions that would eventually contribute to the catastrophe of the heresy. He knew about the Webway project, or at least enough of it to understand what the Emperor was doing in those deep chambers during the Great Crusade. He was present when the Thunder Warriors were culled. The Custodians carried out that operation under his leadership or by his authority. He knew the truth of what the Emperor was and what he was trying to accomplish in ways that went beyond doctrine or faith into direct, personal, witnessed knowledge. After the Siege of Terra, Valdor disappeared. The sources are remarkably sparse on the details of this disappearance. He met with Leman Russ after the heresy ended, in a conversation in which Russ was distraught and Valdor outwardly expressed certainty that the Emperor had foreseen everything while inwardly, the sources note. Valdor was not certain of this at all. He was performing the certainty that the moment required rather than expressing what he actually believed. Then, sometime after, he walked out of the palace at night. He paused once, looking back at the structure he had spent his entire existence serving and protecting, and said to himself, or to the night air, "Only in death does duty end." The implication of those words, in context, is that his duty was not ended, that wherever he was going, he went in service. That the decision to leave was not retirement or defeat or grief made too heavy to carry, but a mission of some kind that required him to not be in the palace anymore. He has not been seen since, or if he has been seen, those who saw him did not know they were seeing him. The lore hints, carefully and without committing to it fully, that Valdor may still be alive somewhere in the galaxy. He was not old in the sense that would have produced biological failure. The Custodians do not age in the conventional way. He was experienced and burdened, and, likely, carrying 10,000 years' worth of that experience by now. But he would still be functional in the physical sense. If Valdor is alive, he is the single greatest repository of direct knowledge about the Emperor's pre-heresy intentions in existence. He is the being who knew the Emperor before the heresy, before the Golden Throne, before the slow drift into godhood that the Imperial Creed has constructed around the Emperor's historical reality. He knows what the Emperor actually wanted, from the testimony of someone who was present for the conversations in which those wants were articulated. He also knows things about the early history of the Custodes and of the Imperium that no surviving record captures. The Custodians maintain their institutional memory carefully, but institutional memory is always mediated. It is what the institution chose to remember, in the form the institution chose to remember it. Valdor is the original, unmediated source. He is the primary document. Where is he? What is he doing? Is he still serving, in some capacity that no longer requires his presence in the palace? Is he one of the eyes of the Emperor, in the most profound sense of that role? An individual who walked away from the institution to continue its work in a different form? The sources leave this open. The Custodians, if they know, are not saying. But the possibility of his continued existence is itself one of the secrets the Custodians carry. The knowledge that the first of them, the founder of the tradition, the person who knew the Emperor before any of what currently exists, may still be out there doing something, in service of something that has not yet revealed its full shape, is part of the complex of uncertainties that defines the current position of the 10,000. Extended Deep Dive, the Emperor's Webway Project, what was actually lost. To fully understand what the Custodians are protecting, you have to understand what the Emperor was trying to build, and what it would have meant if he had succeeded. Because the thing that the Golden Throne is currently doing, sustaining a dying god and keeping a demonic breach sealed, is so far from what the throne was built to do, that understanding the original purpose is like understanding the original purpose of a prison by learning that it was once a library. The Webway, again, is the network of tunnels through the space between spaces, built by the Old Ones and expanded by the Eldari over millions of years. It allows travel between points in the galaxy without entering the warp. The Eldari used it as the foundation of their civilization for millions of years. Even the remnants of the Eldari, after the fall that nearly destroyed their species and created the chaos god Slanesh, retained significant access to the Webway through their craft worlds and through their waypoints and through the intricate navigational knowledge that is one of the primary assets that makes them still relevant in the 41st millennium. The Emperor had a plan to give humanity the same access, not as a subordinate to the Eldari, not as people traveling through someone else's road system, but as the builders of their own extension, their own human-built corridors connecting to the existing Eldari network, and eventually potentially expanding beyond it. An entirely human webway, offering travel to any point in the galaxy without the dangers of the warp, without navigators, without Geller fields, without the risks of demonic intrusion or temporal distortion or the other nightmares that make every warp journey a gamble on the scale of the Immaterium's current mood. This plan, if it had worked, would have changed everything about how the Imperium functions. The black ships, the soul hunters that travel across the Imperium, collecting psychers for delivery to Terra, either for service as astropaths or for sacrifice to the Golden Throne to sustain the Astronomicon, would have become unnecessary. The Astronomicon itself, which requires 1,000 psyker souls per day as fuel, would have become unnecessary. The navigators, The mutant noble houses, whose genetic gift for reading the tides of the warp and steering ships through it is the foundation of all interstellar trade and military logistics in the Imperium, would have become unnecessary. Humanity would have become self-sufficient in a way it has never been since the Dark Age of technology. It would have had access to a transportation and communication network that did not depend on any relationship with the psychic realm, that did not create vulnerabilities to chaos, that did not require the constant sacrifice of human souls to keep functioning. And the Emperor believed this is explicit in the sources that removing humanity's need for warp travel would also, over time, remove humanity's exposure to the warp itself. Less exposure to the warp means fewer psychers being corrupted. Fewer psychers being corrupted means less psychic fuel for the Chaos Gods. Less psychic fuel for the Chaos Gods means weaker Chaos Gods. Over a long enough timeline, and the Emperor was always thinking in timelines that exceeded any individual human life, by orders of magnitude, this might have allowed humanity to grow into a fully psychic species without the existential danger of that evolution being co-opted by the Chaos Gods, who feed on psychic energy the way fire feeds on oxygen. The Emperor was trying to solve the problem of chaos permanently, not by fighting it, the entire history of fighting. Chaos demonstrates that fighting it, on its own terms, is a trap. The more you fight in the warp, the more you feed the warp. The Emperor was trying to route around it. To give humanity a way to exist and thrive that did not run through the warp, and to use the breathing room that created to eventually starve the Chaos Gods of the psychic sustenance that makes them dangerous. This was the plan. This was what the Emperor was doing in those underground chambers beneath the palace, while the Great Crusade raged across the galaxy. This was why he retreated to Terra, why he left Horus in command of the Crusade's final stages, why he was unreachable in those years leading up to the heresy. He was building humanity's salvation. And then Magnus broke the wards, and the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence fought their desperate losing battle in the human-built webway corridors, and the Emperor had to sit down at the machine and hold the door closed with his own psychic force. And then Horus came, and then the siege of Terra happened. And then the Emperor went aboard the Vengeful Spirit to face Horus, and Horus almost killed him, and now he sits on the golden throne holding that door closed in agony while the machine fails around him. The door that the Emperor is holding closed leads into the human-built webway corridors, the unfinished extension that still connects, through its partially constructed structure, to the rest of the webway network. Behind that door, for 10,000 years, the demonic forces that poured through after Magnus's sending have been building pressure. They know what is holding that door closed. They have been working at it for 10,000 years, probing for weaknesses, testing the seal, waiting for the moment when the concentration behind the seal exceeds the power available to hold it. The Custodians know this too. They know that the thing the Emperor is holding is not a metaphorical door or a symbolic responsibility. It is a literal psychic seal on a literal breach between real space and the warp, located physically beneath the Imperial Palace. And if it opens, the consequences begin before any defensive response can be mounted, because the breach opens inside the walls that are meant to prevent exactly that. This is the heart of what the Custodians are guarding. Not just a person, not just an institution, a door, the most important door in the galaxy. And the person holding it closed is the only person who has ever been able to, and he has been doing it for 10,000 years on a machine that was not built for this purpose, and it is getting worse. The Custodians maintain the watch because someone has to. Because there is no alternative that does not involve either the door opening or the person holding it failing, and both of those outcomes are indistinguishable from each other in terms of what they mean for everything else that exists. Extended Deep Dive, the Dark Age of Technology and What Humanity Was. To understand what is in the Dark Cells and the Forbidden Vault, you have to understand something about what humanity was during the Dark Age of Technology, that the Imperial Creed's version of history tends to gloss over. The official narrative treats the Dark Age of Technology as a kind of golden age of human civilization, a period of immense scientific achievement and interstellar empire that was destroyed by forces beyond humanity's control. The age of strife that followed is treated as a catastrophe visited upon humanity by the vagaries of the warp and the emergence of too many psychers and the social instability that followed. That is partially true. but it misses something important about the nature of what humanity was doing during its technological peak, and about the relationship between the achievements of that era and the horrors of the Age of Strife. During the dark age of technology, human science was genuinely without restriction. The ethical frameworks, the institutional controls, the cultural norms that govern what research is pursued and what lines are not crossed, all of those things operated differently, or did not operate at all, in a civilization that had access to technology sophisticated enough to build men of iron and terraform worlds and construct artifacts that defied later understanding. The scientist kings and gene sorcerers of that era operated with a combination of extraordinary capability, and what the surviving evidence suggests was a significantly different relationship to questions of what should be done as opposed to what could be done. What they created, at the extreme end, was things that could not be killed. Biological constructs whose design incorporated redundancies against every known mechanism of destruction. Entities assembled from human genetic material, but operating on principles that placed them outside the category of human in every meaningful sense. Technology that used principles so fundamental to the structure of reality that destroying the technology would require destroying the reality in which it operated. These things survived the collapse of the civilization that created them. When the warlord kings and techno-barbarians of the Age of Strife carved Terra into their personal domains, they encountered the remnants of the Dark Age's most extreme experiments. Some of what they encountered they used to terrible effect. Some of what they encountered they simply feared and fled from. And some of what they encountered, the Emperor, during the Unification Wars, chose to capture rather than destroy, because destroying it was either impossible or because the Emperor saw some future use for it that justified the enormous effort and risk of capturing it instead. These things went into the vaults of Rhython. They went into what are now the Dark Cells. They have been there ever since, and some of them have been there in continuous awareness for the entire duration of their imprisonment. And whatever 10,000 years of that kind of existence does to a consciousness, it has been doing it to these beings in the dark, beneath the most sacred city in the Imperium. The horror of the Dark Cells is not simply that dangerous things are locked inside them. It is that those things were made by humans. They are, in some sense, humanity's most extreme achievements, the proof of what human science and human ambition could produce when given sufficient time and resources and freedom from restraint. They are the dark mirror of the Custodians themselves, where the Custodians are what human biology and human craft can produce when aimed at perfection and protection. The inhabitants of the Dark Cells are what the same capabilities produced when aimed at survival at any cost, power at any price, continuation at the expense of anything that might limit it. There is a reading of the Dark Cells that treats the Custodians and their prisoners as two sides of the same legacy. Both are products of humanity's extreme capabilities. Both have survived into an era where the context that produced them no longer exists. Both are maintained by the structures around the Golden Throne because there is no alternative that does not risk something worse. The Custodians guard the prison partly because they are the best available guards, and partly because the thing they are guarding speaks to something in their own nature that they understand better than anyone else could. What specifically is in those cells beyond the broad description of entities and artifacts from the Age of Strife? The lore is appropriately vague, but the sources note that not all prisoners are truly alive, while all have anima, some form of presence, awareness, will. Some have been in those cells since before the Horus Heresy, which means they have been imprisoned for at least 10,000 years. Some of them are entities whose nature the Custodians themselves cannot fully account for, things whose existence operates on principles that exceed the current understanding of both the Mechanicus and the most learned scholars of the Inquisition. And some of them, when the Great Rift opened, were simply gone. This is the detail that does not get discussed enough. The cells were sealed, the locks were engaged, the wards were intact, and the things that had been in those cells for 10,000 years were not there anymore. Not because they broke out, not because someone opened the doors, but because something happened at the moment of the Great Rift's opening that moved them through all the layers of containment, as though the containment was not there. The Great Rift is a galaxy-spanning tear in the boundary between real space and the warp. When it opened, It changed the psychic environment of the galaxy in fundamental ways. The rules governing what was possible in the interaction between real space and the immaterium shifted. Warded areas that had been stable for 10,000 years suddenly found their wards failing. Psychic phenomena that had been suppressed began breaking through. Daemonic manifestations became more common and more powerful across broad swaths of the Imperium simultaneously. And in the deepest cells beneath the most heavily warded building in the Imperium, things that had been contained by 10,000 years of meticulous maintenance on those wards simply passed through them. Not physically, not in any conventional sense. The cells were empty, not damaged. Whatever happened in a way that left no trace on the containment systems. It was simply as if the things that had been contained were no longer the things that the containment was designed to hold. This is one of the most genuinely frightening things in all of 40K lore, if you spend time with it. The implication is that the things in those cells changed in the moment of the Great Rift's opening, in some way that made them no longer subject to the wards that had held them. They went somewhere outside the cells, outside the palace, outside Terra, into the galaxy. And the Custodians who were there at the time of that transition were found dead, killed in ways consistent with what had been in those particular cells, suggesting that the change, whatever it was not simply a passive transformation, but involved an act. The Shadow Keepers know more about this than anyone. What they know, they are not sharing with anyone outside the Order. But the combination of the dead Custodians and the empty cells, and the pattern of what has been found missing, suggests an event of significant deliberateness, not an accident, not a simple consequence of the Great Rift's opening weakening the wards, something with intention behind it. Something planned for the moment when the rift opened, which means someone or something was planning for that moment, from inside the dark cells, for long enough to have been ready when it came. The Custodes guard against this kind of thing. The Blood Games, the Eyes of the Emperor, the entire intelligence apparatus the 10,000 maintain. All of it is aimed at detecting plans like this before they can be executed. That something nonetheless succeeded in executing a plan of this scope from inside what is supposed to be the most secure location in the Imperium is the kind of failure that defines the new era the Custodians are operating in. The watch continues. It always continues. But what it is watching for has changed, and the things it is watching for are harder to find than they have ever been. Extended Deep Dive, the Sol System and beyond, the Ring of Defense. The Custodians' responsibility does not end at the walls of the Imperial Palace. It extends outward in layers, each one further from the central point of protection, each one serving as a buffer and early warning system for threats that are still at a manageable distance from the thing being protected. The innermost layer is the companions in the throne room. The next layer is the palace itself. Beyond that, the Custodians maintain a presence throughout the Sol System, on Luna, on Venus, on Pluto, on numerous deep space star fortresses that watch the approaches to Terra from further out in the solar gravity well. These are not large deployments in the sense of thousands of Custodians. They are strategic presences, specific individuals or small groups, positioned at locations that give them the best possible view of what is moving through the system and the best possible ability to respond to threats while they are still at a manageable distance. The Custodians maintain a liaison with the Imperial Fist's Space Marine chapter, specifically because the Fists have maintained their role as joint guardians of the Sol System since the days of Rogel Dorn. The Fist's massive mobile star fort, the phalanx once repaired through the remarkable expedient of the Shadow Keepers opening one of the dark cells, has held a protective orbit over Terra for periods stretching across entire centuries. The relationship between the Custodians and the Imperial Fists in the defense of the Sol System is one of the most consistent and least discussed partnerships in the Imperium, maintained through 10,000 years of joint purpose without any formal treaty or diplomatic arrangement. It simply exists because both organizations understand what needs to be done. Further out still, the Eyes of the Emperor represent the Custodians' reach across the full extent of the Imperium and beyond. They are the most diffuse layer of the defense, the outermost ring, the earliest possible warning of threats that are still forming rather than yet moving. By the time a threat that the Eyes have identified has traveled from wherever it originated to the Sol System, the Custodians want to have had years or decades of advance notice, long enough to prepare a response, long enough to intervene before arrival becomes a crisis. The entire system, from the throne room to the far reaches, is oriented around the same fundamental understanding of time and distance. The further out you detect a threat, the more time you have to address it. The more time you have, the greater the range of possible responses available to you. The Custodians extend their reach as far as they can, as early as they can, because the alternative, waiting for threats to manifest close enough to Terra to be obvious, is a strategy that leaves insufficient time for the only response that matters, which is preventing the threat from reaching the throne room at all. This is why the expansion of Custodians operations beyond Terra in the era Indomitus is not simply about deploying more warriors to more places. It is a fundamental recalibration of how far out the first layer of detection and response needs to be. The threats of the 41st millennium are more numerous, more powerful, and more unpredictable than the threats that defined the previous 10,000 years. The first layer of protection needs to be further out than it has ever been. Behind locked doors, after meeting with Guilliman, Captain General Trajan Valoris made this decision. The Custodians would go further. They would strike earlier. They would engage threats at greater distances from Terra than ever before in the post-heresy era. Not because the palace was now less important, but because the palace's safety now required action at distances that only the eye of the Emperor and the forward-deployed shield hosts can cover. This is how the secrets of the Custodians play out in the current era. Not just guarding the throne room, not just managing the dark cells, not just maintaining the blood games in the eyes, but actively projecting force into a galaxy that is darker and more hostile than it has been since the Horus Heresy, in service of a protection that becomes more difficult every year, in support of a machine that is failing, and a god who is transforming into something that no one can fully name. The watch continues. It always continues, because in the grim darkness of the far future, continuing is the only option available, and the Custodians have never stopped continuing. A final word on why this matters. The secrets the Custodians keep are not just interesting trivia about an ancient institution in a fictional setting. They speak to something about the nature of authority and knowledge, and the relationship between the people who know the truth and the people whose lives depend on that truth being managed correctly. Every civilization has its Custodians. Every institution of sufficient size and age eventually develops a class of people who know things that cannot be widely shared, who maintain systems that the people benefiting from those systems cannot be told about, who protect things, whose protection requires that the people being protected not understand the full scope of what is being done on their behalf. The Custodians in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 push this dynamic to its extreme, against the backdrop of stakes that dwarf anything a real civilization has faced, and ask the question of what that extreme version looks like. What it looks like is 10,000 golden warriors in a palace built over a bomb, guarding a dying god on a failing machine, in service of a plan that may or may not exist, and a future that may or may not be the one intended, in the deepest loyalty that bioalchemy and cellular binding and 10,000 years of shared purpose can produce. It is not comfortable. It was never meant to be comfortable. It is simply what duty looks like when it is taken all the way to the end. The watch continues. Thank you for keeping it with me tonight.